I was contacted by an Orthodox priest. He's telling me his story. And at one point in the story, he says, well, and then I worked with the Warrens for a while. I was like, hold on. So you don't happen to mean like Ed and Lorraine Warren, like The Conjuring, the Warrens, like the Warrens.
Lorraine.
Nice to meet you, Roger Ed Warren.
They were sort of the OG ghost hunters, right? His conclusion when he came away from that was he was like, I'm convinced that the spiritual world is real. And my whole pitch was I want to buy your story rights and I want to make a Conjuring universe of my own based on your case files. I secured a blessing from my priest, before I went into it. But at the same time, I was warned, like, you start paying attention to the demons, they'll pay attention to you in a different sort of way. So there was a lot of phenomena that started in my world as a result of this.
Actual kind of experiences of the supernatural.
That's right, yeah. Extreme things like somebody hears something like walk into their bedroom that they can't see and it pulls the sheets off them. I would work on the script and then something I'd written into the script, one of my kids has a nightmare and it's the changes I made to the script the previous day. Or I work on a horror scene construction that is modeled in some ways after my own basement and it involves, the light bulb explodes and I go down in the basement and lo and behold, that light bulb explodes. It just became almost commonplace that this stuff was happening. In the interest of my family, I went ahead and said, okay, I'm out, and I pulled out of the project.
Nathan Jacobs, welcome to the channel.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. I feel like our interests overlap in quite a lot of ways. You're fascinated by theology and filmmaking and horror, and so am I, maybe from a slightly different perspective, but it kind of makes sense to sit down and chew some of those things over. You almost made a feature-length horror film. Could you take us through how that came about and why it didn't happen in the end?
Sure. So just by way of background here, I'll give a quick little biographical sketch, since I'm guessing that people on your channel probably don't know who I am. But I'm an artist turned scholar of philosophy of religion turned filmmaker. And so I went on this, I started out in art school, fine arts, painting and drawing. And then actually due to a bad LSD trip, I ended up going out on this long spiritual religious journey that ended up, I accumulated all sorts of degrees in church history, historical theology, and philosophy, and all these different areas. Eventually became a college professor, a reputable scholar in different fields. And along the way, though, I started working in film, which was sort of unexpected. Initially, it was because I started toying with the video game industry. During my grad studies, I paid the bills by actually, for this company that would eventually go under, and none of the things I worked on actually saw the light of day, unfortunately. But I did concept art, and I did storyboards, and I did cut scenes, and I did, all of these different things that, basically are movie pre-visualization. And for that reason, when I started to bump into filmmakers, and this was during a time when filmmakers were sort of scattering throughout the US because of different tax incentives where people were trying to draw them to different states, draw that business there. I started bumping into all sorts of filmmakers in Chicago and Michigan, wherever it might be. And then because of that, I ended up, showing my work to a lot of these folks who were like, oh, have you ever thought about trying your hand at film? You should really consider it. And I was very dismissive at first, but over time, I just couldn't resist the possibility of wading into those waters. And so to make a very long story relatively short, I ended up, taking the leap and doing a short film. And then that was successful enough that folks had said, like, yeah, let's do a feature. And so I bootstrapped a feature film, which was a college comedy, Killing Poe, as an Edgar Allan. And then as that was preparing for release, I was asked to do a documentary. And that was actually, I was asked by the Antiochian Archdiocese. So you saw that documentary, obviously, which was Becoming Truly Human. And it was sort of a strange project because the Archdiocese wanted to engage religiously unaffiliated folks. And so I thought that was a strange thing to ask me as somebody who does feature narrative stuff. But I ended up pitching to them this concept of how you could do a documentary of sorts that would, on the one hand, be an accurate representation of the phenomenon of dissociation from religion, while also at the same time opening up conversation between religious and non-religious people about topics. And that was that documentary. Now, the reason that's important is for two reasons. The first reason is because it's the reason I ended up leaving teaching. So when I was asked to do that documentary, I was a college professor, and I just sort of took a sabbatical in order to, do that documentary. And then that what was supposed to be just, a 1-year hiatus turned into longer because they were like, well, we'd like you to go around with it to the different showings and do Q&As. And so I ended up taking another semester off. And then eventually I was asked, would you consider leaving teaching altogether to go full-time in film? And there were some investors who were willing to get behind a project that had developed, which was that horror project. And so that's where we arrive at the sort of unexpected twist that the next project I was working on was a horror film. So by way of context of what that project was while I was doing screening of religiously unaffiliated folks, and this was, just for folks who are unaware, right? There was this term nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people with no religion. And this was a new phenomenon. At the time, this was, 2015, I think it was. And so there had just been all this sociological research that in the US, at least, there had been this spike in people leaving religion. Previously, it had only been 5 to 7% of the US would be identified as having no religion. And it sort of jumped up to, around, depending on the survey, like 20%, something like that. And so that caught a lot of people's attention. And as I started doing the interviews, I had suspicions about what was going on, but I wanted to do proper sort of sociological research of sitting down and interviewing people. And one of the things that I noticed was that very few were atheists. Most of the people who had left religion still believed in God or a higher power. They believed in fate. They believed that they were spiritual beings. They believed the world was meaningful. There were all these sorts of trends about broad spirituality. And I found that that wasn't just my sample. When the Pew Research Center went ahead and did a bunch of research, released a research dump on some of these same topics, they found the same thing. That if you ask about a higher power, basically 90% would believe in God or a higher power, something like that. Only 10% would be atheists, which was the same as what I had found. But the other thing that I had noticed, which doesn't really factor heavily into the documentary, I hint at it at one point in the documentary, but I didn't bring it into the documentary because it was too peculiar. It would have just sat there as this awkward appendage in it, which was that 100% of the folks I interviewed believed in ghosts. And
Really?
that was surprising, right? So even the atheists. So I remember there was this couple from New York who I really loved. And I was like, yes, I would love to have them in the documentary. Scheduling didn't work out, so I didn't get to bring them in there. But they had been married for 3 years. And I got to the topic of, God. And I was like, just going through my normal, sort of questions on, do you believe in God? And the husband said, like, absolutely. And the wife said, absolutely not. And they looked at each other like, you do? You don't? And they had never actually discussed the question amongst themselves, which was wild to me. But what was interesting is that when I sort of raised the discussion of why, right, the wife was saying, well, I don't believe in God, science, right? But then there was this turn that somehow ghosts came up. And she was like, our apartment is haunted. And she was dead serious. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting phenomenon. Like, you don't believe in God because of science. She never really explained what that means, but you don't believe in God, but you do believe in ghosts. You believe in spirits of some kind, just not one you would call God. That's interesting. And I found that again and again, that different people, when ghosts would come up and be like, oh yeah, I'm a sucker for ghost hunter shows, man. I just can't get enough of them. And it was a really interesting thing to notice that pattern. And then I encountered the research of a sociologist, Clay Rutledge, who had actually studied this phenomenon. And Clay had essentially noted the same thing that I discovered, which was that when people dissociate from religion, rather than becoming sort of materialist atheists, the majority of them still are looking for some form of spirituality. And more often than not, they move into the paranormal and the occult. And what was interesting when I looked at the Pew research on the same points, Pew had found that non-religious people are more likely to believe in the paranormal than religious people, ironically enough. So I thought this was a really fascinating thing, and I was trying to figure out what to do with it. And over time, just as somebody who really believes that it's possible to do storytelling in a way that is deep and rich in terms of philosophy and theology, I'm always looking for projects, ways of telling a story that allows me to delve into world building and into topics that I actually care about as a philosopher and a theologian. And it occurred to me that horror really takes seriously the spiritual world. And it not only takes seriously the spiritual world, it takes it seriously in a way that requires you to establish the rules of that universe. Whenever you're doing a horror movie, we have to say, like, what is it? What is the monster? Where did it come from? What does it want? Right? How do we stop it? Right? And you inevitably are thrust into world building of a kind that is essentially a form of philosophy and theology. You're dealing in metaphysical realities at that point. And I never really noticed that about horror. I always had a soft spot for horror as a genre, but I never really noticed that in particular until I was toying with the question of what do I do with this fact, right? This sociological trend. And around the same time that I was just sort of moving in this direction of thinking, maybe I should do something in the genre of horror, I was contacted by an Orthodox priest. I'm Eastern Orthodox. That's where my long spiritual journey led me, was to the Eastern Orthodox Church very late in life. This Orthodox priest had seen my documentary and heard about me, and he wanted to reach out. And so, I was just having a chat with him, and I asked him about his bio. And so he's telling me his story. And at one point in the story, he says, and then I worked with the Warrens for a while, and he moved on in the story. And I stopped him because I know those names. I'm sure you know those names, and I'm guessing people who watch your channel know those names. But just in case there are anybody who's watching who doesn't, right? Ed and Lorraine Warren are these figures on the East Coast and, in the United States, I believe they're both deceased at this point. But they were sort of the OG ghost hunters, right? They were the original ghost hunters who would go around and try to gather evidence of different paranormal phenomenon, of demonic oppression, whatever it might be. And then through gathering the evidence, they would go ahead and take that to the Catholic Church, and they try to say, send an exorcist or whatever. And so they had, all of these famous case files. Amityville Horror, of course, the Conjuring universe is based on their case files. And so I knew who the Warrens were, right? I had seen The Conjuring. I knew about this. And so when he said that, then I worked with the Warrens for a while. He's like, hold on. You said you worked with the Warrens. You don't happen to mean like Ed and Lorraine Warren, like The Conjuring, the Warrens, like the Warrens. And he sheepishly was like, yeah, those are the Warrens. I was like, I got to hear the story. I got to know what it is. And what was wild to me was he shared this story that sounded very much like the religiously unaffiliated I had interviewed. He was raised Roman Catholic. He became disillusioned with that. He wandered away from his faith. He didn't quite know what he believed, but what he became interested in was the paranormal. That's how he discovered Ed and Lorraine. Started, like, this is back in the days of like public access and VHS tapes. So he's like sitting there getting his hands on anything he can, their books, their videos, whatever it is. And then because I forget exactly where he lived at the time, but he lived in their vicinity, right? He lived near them. So if you've seen The Conjuring, you know that there's a scene in the first Conjuring movie where they show the Annabelle, story. And then they're there in this college lecture hall, showing the footage and giving these lectures. And that was a thing that Ed and Lorraine did. They'd go around to colleges and they'd give these talks and show footage and all this sort of stuff. So he went to one of those. And he was just enraptured with the whole thing. And then he went to another and another. And because he was a journalism major, he thought he had something to offer. So he reached out to them and he was like, hey, I'm a journalism major. I'm very interested in what you guys do. Is there any world where you could use some help, right? That I could work for you? And so the true case files of, these case files, he started working on. So they had, and they had a regular journal, right? The journal, I forget what it's called, but of paranormal research that they would put out, and he would publish in it, or he would edit their stuff. There's in the first Conjuring movie where they mentioned that Ed's working on a book. He worked on that book as a ghostwriter, no pun intended, helping Ed try to get that manuscript into view. And so he went with them on different cases, and he got to see for himself what they did. And his conclusion when he came away from that was he was like, I'm convinced that the spiritual world is real. And he was convinced that there was some significance, spiritual significance to the person of Jesus Christ. And the reason he thought that was because he noticed this pattern that in a lot of cases, people would have some sort of like oppression or phenomenon. And a lot of them would try things like burning sage or bringing in a medium or something like that. And it would always get worse. And then what would happen is the Warrens would bring in a priest and it would get better. And he just took that to be empirical evidence. Okay, there's some spiritual significance to the person of Jesus. And so that made him rethink his faith. But the problem was he was genuinely disillusioned with Roman Catholicism. And so he had to sort of go back and say, what does this mean for me? And the short version is that he eventually, through his looking into historical Christianity, discovered Eastern Orthodoxy, became an Eastern Orthodox priest. And while he thought that was sort of the end of his road in terms of ghost hunting and all the rest, because he's not going to ghost hunt as, an Orthodox priest. What happened is that world is such a small world that when people would come to Ed and Lorraine after they were retired and say, hey, there's this thing happening, they would say, well, we don't do that anymore, but we know a priest if you want to contact him. And so he started having all these people come to him because of his work with the Warrens. And when you look at it, what you see is you see that he ended up having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of his own cases. And so when I heard that, I just was like, look, here's what I want to do, right? And my whole pitch was I want to buy your story rights and I want to make a Conjuring universe of my own based on your case files. And I wouldn't hide the fact that you worked with Ed and Lorraine. That would be part of your backstory as a character. But of course, in world building in the film, because we're going to pick a point of view and the point of view is yours, obviously the rules of the universe as you understand are going to be the rules that you understand. And so they're going to be orthodox. And so a lot of films that have a religious worldview, The Exorcist, whatever it might be, they end up having a Catholic ethos more often than not. Whereas I was like, here you actually have an opportunity to highlight this very sort of unexpected twist in the horror world, which is this untapped, orthodox ethos and rules of the universe and all the rest. And Father Maximus is his name. So Father Maximus, he had been asked to do different, film story rights, things like that before, and he had always said no. You can see him in like Did the Devil Make Me Do It, that Netflix documentary they did. He appears in there. They interview him in that one.
Yeah.
So he's done a couple of interviews, but not a lot. He largely tried to avoid all of that. But in my case, because he was like, you're Orthodox, you're a trained historical theologian, you're a philosopher, he's like, you're the one person I would actually trust to handle the source material properly. So he signed over his story rights. I bought him. And that's when we started working on They Dwell Among Us was the name of the film. And so that film went through a number of iterations, but it caught the attention of a lot of people. We started working with Mike Flaherty, who is the founder of Walden Media. Mike ended up introducing me to this guy, Sean Devereaux, who, if you look up him, he's worked on 100 movies, all of which you've heard of. And so Sean was just sort of asked to look at the script and give certain estimates on budget stuff as a favor to Mike. And Sean was like, I don't read scripts. Like too many scripts come my way. I don't read them. But he decided he'd have coffee with me. And I showed him my storyboards, my animatics, all these sorts of things that I had done because that's what I do, right? I'm that kind of director. And he was so blown away by that. He actually did read the script. And then after reading the script, he's like, I want to be a producer on this. Like, can I work with you on that? And so then Sean came in. And then Sean quickly got us in conversation with Lionsgate. And so there was, Sean had basically, there's a division of Lionsgate Kingdom Story Company. They're a separate entity, but they had just signed a massive deal with Lionsgate at the time. And, Sean was basically talking to the head of Lionsgate, or of not Lionsgate, of Kingdom, which is John Irwin. Now, John's an evangelical faith-based sort of filmmaker, doesn't do horror at all. But he read the script and he was like, whoa. and so he got a lot of flack for that, actually, because a lot of people at Kingdom were like, this is not our brand. And John was insistent, I don't care if Kingdom is associated with it. I just want to see it get made because this is like really great. And he was a big believer in mine, which was critical to my sort of journey through film. But anyway, the next thing you know, I'm sitting in Lionsgate Studios off in LA, and was it in LA? I think it's in Santa Monica. So I'm in like Lionsgate Studios in Santa Monica and having conversations with them, and we're doing test footage and all that stuff. And it looked like maybe there was a path to get this thing made. And then COVID hit, and all of Hollywood shut down. And so that's when the project really got stalled, and we always had trouble getting it, sort of back up and running. I mean, we did end up having meetings with Blumhouse and other things along the line, but and there was always this interest, always people sniffing around this project. Another disruption was that Russell Crowe film where he was an exorcist. I forget what it is.
Was it The Pope's Exorcist? Was it called?
Yes, The Pope's Exorcist. Yeah. So all of a sudden they were like, oh, that one just came out. So like the appetite for another exorcist project, is diminished. So there were just all these different hurdles that seemed to always stall it. And I'll just say, like right now, it does seem that there's a new group that's looking at it, and it may well get made, right? Like right now, it does seem that it has a path to greenlight. But my own involvement, you mentioned, that I pulled out of the project, and that was true. So I was the writer and the director. It was my concept. I was the one, Father Maximus entrusted. I was the one that Sean was getting behind. Like everybody there believed in my vision for the project. But the fact of the matter is that I took very seriously the material, the fact that I'm dealing with the demonic. And so I didn't want to go into that project without taking that seriously. So I secured a blessing from my priest, before I went into it. Father Maximus secured a blessing from his bishop to work on the project. But at the same time, I was warned by Father Maximus, like, you start paying attention to the demons, they'll pay attention to you, like, in a different sort of way. And I was warned about that. I had gone to a monastery soon before I started, and one of the monks came to me and was like, are you sure this project is worth it? And he was basically getting at that very same point. And I kind of naively said, like, of course, I'm sure it'll be fine, right? I'm doing this for good reasons, right? My motivations are good. I've got a priest who's sort of sticking close to our family, and it'll be fine. And yet it wasn't fine, right? So there was a lot of phenomena that started in my world as a result of this. And
actual kind of experiences of the supernatural.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
And things that really are the sort of thing that you go, oh, that's probably just like a horror movie exaggeration. But it was like, no, it's not. Right. So we did have the sort of things start to happen where, extreme things like somebody hears something like walk into their bedroom that they can't see and it pulls the sheets off them, like that sort of thing. Phenomenon like that. We had very strange sort of like nudges and taunts where I would work on the script, and then something I'd written into the script, one of my kids has a nightmare, and it's the changes I made to the script the previous day. Or I work on a horror scene construction, that is modeled in some ways after my own basement. And it involves, one of the key moments in the scare is where the light bulb explodes. And I go down in the basement and lo and behold, that light bulb explodes. Right. Like, so there were all sorts of things like that actually almost became commonplace to the point that you'd sit there and you'd watch like something turn off your coffee maker. And this is a coffee maker that's like an old archaic switch. Like there is no kill switch on it, right? This isn't a short. And you turn it back on and you watch it as it turns it off. And then you turn it back on and you watch as it turns off. And it does it 3 times, which is always one of these patterns with the mnemonic of patterns of 3. And so it just became almost commonplace that this stuff was happening. And for me, I was kind of, I would experience these things, but I was like, well, it just goes with the territory of doing this sort of project. Like when we were doing test footage, I ended up working on some of the props that we were going to do. So there's a case file that involved a guy who worked in black magic. He had certain summoning rituals that he would do, and basically, in these summoning rituals, he'd use his skull. He had a skull book, or he had a black magic text. The skull would move and candles on it would light, and all these sorts of things like that. So we were doing this test scene related to that case. And so I was going to construct his spell book because I wanted to actually use real black magic summoning rituals, because I wanted the authenticity of it. And so I would go through and read like actual black magic texts, and I would go through and I'd modify the Latin in them so as to not, have it be an actual summoning ritual, negating terms and so on. But while I'd work on that, I would actually feel this sort of like dark energy settle in and make me physically ill. And I'd just sort of work until I'm like, okay, I can't work anymore. Right. And then I'd stop, and I'd have to warn prop artists, like, if weird stuff starts happening, you have to tell me, right? Like because we have to address it. And again, we were trying to be careful, right? Something would happen in the house. We'd call in a priest, do confession, have them bless the house, right? We would, if we were on set, I had a priest come in and bless the space before I went ahead and actually painted the sigil on the concrete. And then after we finished, doing the entire scene, we'd scrub that off and then we'd bless the space again. Like, so we were trying to be careful, but the fact of the matter is it did take a toll. And even though I was sort of naively approaching this saying, like, oh, it'll be fine. I'm doing it for the right reasons. This isn't gratuitous, whatever it might be. What I was oblivious to until actually after my divorce, I was oblivious to the fact that my kids were terrified by the project. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I had some conversations after the divorce when I'm trying to like just make sure that the relationships are whole and repair any damage that's been done. And I remember one conversation in particular where I was expecting, okay, I'm going to hear that you're upset about the divorce. And it was like, no, I'm upset about that project you worked on. That terrified me. And I started to have my eyes open to the fact that like, oh, there's all these people who are in my care who have been terrorized by this project. And I'm sitting here going, oh, it's fine, right? Like it's all for a good cause. Whereas for them, it was like, no, like I don't want anything to do with that. And it really freaks me out that you're involved in that. I'm afraid, that you have demonic attachments or we have demonic attachments or whatever. And that was where, in the interest of my family, I went ahead and said, okay, I'm out, and I pulled out of the project. So the script still exists. The producers still have it. Like I said, it's possible they have a pathway to funding now. And so that project might still come out, but I had made a point to withdraw, saying I'm not going to direct it, which was always the original plan. So there you go. That's the story.
It's quite a story. No, thanks for sharing that, because I think when I first heard you tell that, there was part of me thinking, oh, crumbs, what am I doing with this YouTube channel looking at horror films from a Christian perspective? And I imagine you still believe that there's a place for horror storytelling, and we can maybe get into that. But nonetheless, I think that does serve as a cautionary tale that it is possible to enter into even a project with good intentions, telling a story from a Christian perspective, and still the act of telling it has some dangers. And I wonder if, you could speak to the added dimension of cinema, because it's one thing writing a script for a horror story, or just writing down a horror story that engages with the demonic and maybe does so from a very biblical perspective. But then to actually film that and to get actors to do these things on screen, our impulse is to say, oh, well, it's just acting, it's just pretend,
Right.
that kind of thing. But maybe are we not able to draw that line as neatly as we'd like in getting your actors to pretend to do a Ouija board for the purposes of moving the horror story along? Are you actually unwittingly inviting them to participate in something demonic? Do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe the challenges of bringing it to the screen?
Yeah, I think there's two challenges that come to mind, and there's probably more, but these are just, sort of my immediate thoughts in terms of challenges. One of those challenges is exactly what you're talking about, right? Which is, and I tried to address it in my own way, right? So I take a black magic summoning ritual, and I take the Latin, and then I modify the Latin so that rather than summoning something, you're saying I'm not summoning you, right, or something like that, right? I'd go ahead and modify the language of it. And yet, I think one of the problems you run into is that, one of the problems, and as I said, there's two that come to mind. One of the problems is that a lot of these sorts of symbols and things like that actually do have attachment. So I'll talk a little bit about symbology, and not, necessarily symbology in the storytelling sense, but in the ontological sense. So we today, as products of modernity and post-modernity now, we have a tendency probably toward materialism, right? We think of the world as concrete objects. And if two things are disconnected, then if one thing's over here and one thing's over here, they're not connected, right? Because connections are inherently mechanical and material. But that's not how the ancient world thought about things. When it came to symbols or of names, one of the things that they noticed is that there was an inherent connection between those things. So when Plato is talking about, he's exploring the nature of an image, for example, or a likeness. He's one of the things that he observes that he finds very interesting is that certain objects, when you define them, like a square, you can define in a contained way, right? Four sides, right angles, right? Things like that. And you don't have to refer to anything outside of it. But when you start to talk about an image, now all of a sudden it's inherently referential. It's the image of, right? You could do the same thing with names. It's the name of. And so what Plato finds interesting about this is that it's an essential, which is to say an inextricable trait of image, that it's tethered to its archetype, of name, that it's tethered to that which it names, right? Things like that. And Plato's not the only one who thinks this way. So what's interesting is if you look at the prohibition on idols, right? Anybody who has a cursory knowledge of the Bible knows that somewhere in the 10 Commandments it says that you're not supposed to worship idols, right? You don't have to be a Bible scholar to know that. But if you look at, I believe it's in Deuteronomy 4, the second law, God goes ahead and exposits that commandment and why you're not supposed to, make any. And what's interesting is if you look at it in Greek, I paused before I finished that sentence. In Greek, you do have a word for idol, but idol isn't the word used in Deuteronomy 4. It's likeness. And the reason is you're not supposed to make a likeness of something in heaven or a likeness of something that crawls on the earth. And then when God says, why? He says, because you heard a voice, but you saw no likeness. And it says that several times. You heard a voice, you saw no likeness. In other words, the point is saying, if you make a likeness of a cow or a reptile, that's not my likeness. That likeness belongs to a cow. That likeness belongs to a reptile. And if you worship that, you'll be worshiping its archetype, which is not me. Right. And so that same point that Plato sees there is there in that. And that comes out very explicitly. It comes out explicitly in intertestamental literature in Wisdom of Solomon. The same point is made about images and archetypes. And then it becomes critical in the church fathers, the Eastern church fathers, when they're talking about iconography and how they understand icons to be tethered to the things that they image. And so the reason I bring that up is because while that is a sort of lost way of thinking for us, I think it's probably correct. And obviously, I do believe it's correct. That's too soft. And I think even people who don't explicitly think that way still intuitively think that way. They intuitively understand that. And one of the ways I would explain it when I teach on, specifically this concept of energia, and which is related to spiritual transference in the ancient world. And to help students understand that, I would sometimes say, let me paint a picture for you, right? You buy a new house. You're excited. Great house, right? Then you discover, oh, the house has an attic. I didn't know it had an attic. And you go up into the attic and you find a satanic altar. Now, everybody in the room immediately gasps, right? Like, it's like the air gets sucked out of the room. And then I would just casually ask it, like, what would you do with it? Would you take it downstairs and use it as a coffee table? And everybody's like, inevitably, there would always be somebody who'd say, I'd burn it. And I would ask, why? It's just a table, right? But something in them says, that's not just a table. That's attached to something, right? It's why when you walk into an occult store, if you walk into a occult store, you're like, something feels off about this. Or you handle a black magic text, you're like, I don't think this is just a book, right? And I think that instinct is there in us intuitively. I think the reverse of that is also there for people, right? Like people who want to go ahead and say, I really wish I could go to where Jesus walked, right? And touch something that he touched. Yeah, they can reason that away as psychological, historical interest. But a lot of people have this intuition that it's not just, if it was touched by him, it's not just normal, right? Like there's something there, like it rubs off. And the reason I think that's important is because when I paint a sigil to film a scene, I am painting a sigil that's meant to summon something. It is attached to something. And I can have all my good intentions that I want. And I can try to negate black magic spells. But the problem is at some point, if you're playing with real names and real symbols, they really are the symbols of or the names of. And that's really kind of dangerous. And I learned that firsthand the hard way. So I think that is one danger. That reality of the tether between those things creates a very real problem that I don't necessarily know how to solve. And I'll just quickly say the other thing. Well, unless you want to interject here on that point before I go to the other point.
No, keep going. This is great.
Okay, so the other one is just this, that somebody said to me once, I think rightly, he's a writer that I was working with on a different project, and it was actually when They Dwell Among Us had come across the desk of Michael B. Jordan, and he was interested in the project because he was looking for some sort of elevated horror thing. But I had already withdrawn from the project at that point. But he was only interested in if I was going to do the project because I was the thing that made it elevated. So anyway, that whole thing fell apart, and it ended up being, instead he ended up doing Sinners, right? But there was, during that time, where I was obviously tempted to be like, man, should I pick this project back up? Michael B. Jordan's interested, right? And I was talking to somebody about it, and they basically, one of the analogies they drew is they're like, I think the simple question is like, if you were to do a documentary series on like the cartel, right? And that documentary series was not good for them because it exposed them. How do you think the cartel would feel about that? And I was like, yeah, probably not very good. And I should probably expect them to come after my family and everything I own, everything I love, and whatever else. And I think that's the other real danger in it. And I think that needs to be taken seriously. Now, obviously, there are people who choose paths that are difficult for that. Somebody who picks being an exorcist is obviously stepping into that sort of territory. Somebody who becomes a priest in general is stepping into that territory. So there's always dangers like that. But I think that is a second thing that always a person has to be mindful of, because that's the reality of it.
Wow, yeah. And I think there are lots of stories like this on horror movies that grapple explicitly with the supernatural. Because as we'll come on to, there are lots of other types of horror. Jaws, for instance, is a horror film.
Right, sure.
But it doesn't have a demonic element, absolutely. But you hear stories of, for instance, The Exorcist being written by a devout Catholic, William Peter Blatty, and was made by a kind of agnostic William Friedkin. And so the story itself is a very confessionally Catholic story, as you said, in terms of he wanted to show that if such evil exists, then there is also a God. If the devil exists, God exists, basically, is the argument of that film. And so in terms of the story, yes, you see those good intentions there. And yet you do hear that the process of making that film, there were all sorts of weird things that happened. And exactly what you were just saying, some people look at that and say, well, they were actually unwittingly kind of opening doors to the demonic and being oppressed by that. Others would say it was a sign that the demons didn't want it to be made, so they were kind of getting riled up. Maybe it was a combination.
I think both could be true.
Yeah. But it certainly gives you pause for thought, doesn't it? I would certainly think twice about directing a horror movie explicitly about the occult that is depicting people doing rituals or something like that.
Yeah, it's a very real challenge. And I think, and as you said, that doesn't mean that horror as a whole becomes problematic, because there are any number of, and I'm not even sure that everything that has a sort of demonic vibe to it is equally problematic. Like It Follows, right? Like, it's a completely fabricated sort of urban legend type thing. It's not obviously a demon, right? I'm not sure that has the same sort of dangers to it as the sorts of things that I was doing, which was very real case files, very real demons, very real practices, and all that.
Yeah. What do you make of the Warrens now, kind of looking back, and your friend as well? Because I've heard mixed reports that they were confessionally Catholic themselves, and as you mentioned, they did bring exorcists to the scene. They were kind of seen as being at odds with the church and kind of going around the church in some cases. But I think recently they've been their work has been scrutinized quite a lot, and some people claim that they were trying to sensationalize stuff in order to make money out of the books, or that they were essentially feeding off people that may have had genuine kind of demonic encounters, but they weren't necessarily. I heard an interview with an exorcist who said that he was concerned about their kind of room full of trinkets that they kept from their cases. And they claimed that it was a bit like taking guns off the street, that they just need to lock all these demonized objects and dolls in one room. But the fact that it was kind of in their house or near their house, and they would show people around this, there is something a little bit weird about what the Warrens were doing. Yeah.
No, so I've asked Father Maximus about this quite a bit, and I have quite a bit of footage of him being interviewed on this very topic, which I would love to see the light of day sometime. But I think the challenge is that yes, like I think the Warrens are a mixed bag, and I don't think Father Maximus would deny that. I don't want to speak on his behalf, so Father, if you're listening, right, like you are free to correct the record. Maybe you jump down in the comments and do so. I don't know. But anyway, it's, my impression is that, yes, of course, the Warrens doing the sort of work they did toy with things that were not strictly Catholic, right? They were doing things that the Catholic Church wouldn't advocate for a person to do, like EVPs and things like that, like are definitely things that you are cautioned against doing. And they developed their own sort of peculiar theology based on that. And so I think there's a sense in which the Warrens probably fell into a form of syncretism of some kind, where they are definitely sort of toying with practices and mixing and matching theology that, on the one hand, yes, they're Catholic, right? But that doesn't mean that their beliefs or their practices are fully reflective of what a Catholic person should do, right? Or what the Catholic Church would endorse. I think that's true. In terms of whether or not they ever dealt with authentic phenomena, I think the answer, based on my knowledge of Father Maximus, is yes. That being the very thing that was critical to sort of awakening him and saying, like, no, I think this stuff is real. So I think that's true. Now, whether or not that stuff was sensationalized, I'm sure it's sensationalized. I mean, I know that in my own sort of writing of They Dwell Among Us, when you get to the climax, you're like, we really do need an event here that, you can't just have them, read the exorcist prayers and the person's fine, right? And,
Sure.
The story's over, right? Like, that doesn't work. And so inevitably, whenever you're engaged in storytelling, you have to create these certain arcs and escalations and things like that. And inevitably, I think with some of these stories that become sensationalized. And so I'm sure that there is truth to that as well. And whether or not there were bad actors and bad motives, I think, Father Maximus has never talked to me too explicitly about how he sees all that. But I think he does see, like, the Warrens as sincere, genuinely wanting to help people. I think he also, when he looked at them, he recognized that they're also flawed, and so they had their own problems and things like that. And he also recognized that a lot of the people who will reach out to somebody like the Warrens, there are bad actors, right? So he's had all sorts of, he told me, I had to do a little bit of investigating, but he told me, I won't tell you who, right? But he said that there was one guy who came to me with a case file, and my investigation led me to believe that he was full of crap, right? Like, that this wasn't real. He's making this up.
Right.
And lo and behold, he ended up on, like, a Ghost Hunters show eventually. Got his own episode for that. And then lo and behold, he's also trying to sell the story rights, to his haunting experience. So do you have people who are charlatans, right? Who are trying to sort of gin up stories and cases for mixed motives, either to humiliate the investigator and show, see, you're an idiot who's, wrong. Or because I want to sell my story rights because I smell money or things like that. I think that stuff is always sort of inevitable in the space of, paranormal investigation, now that it's become something that is a cultural, something that's culturally front and center and hypothetically lucrative. But I don't think those facts end up nullifying everything about the Warrens. And so, but this is, again, me going entirely off of Father Maximus's firsthand experience of them. And I just recognize that inevitably, when you're talking about optics, your perspective on a person changes considerably if you actually know the person, as opposed to just dealing with whatever is sort of leaked in the public or talked about in the public. And so that's where, I'm inclined to favor, in some ways, Father Maximus's own experience was with them, given that he really knew them.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I wanted to ask in a sense, because people can say all sorts of things online, but actually hearing from someone who knew them, that certainly puts things in perspective. Wow, okay, so that's so much to chew on. But could we kind of shift gear to horror in general, and maybe the fact that you haven't walked away from horror as a genre entirely as a result of that experience? So maybe what is a horror story, and what makes a good horror story as opposed to a gratuitous, exploitative horror story? Everyone knows there are plenty of horror films we wouldn't want to check out, like Human Centipede, Serbian film, just kind of wallowing in depravity. So what is a good horror story?
Yeah. So in terms of just sort of drawing the boundary lines around horror genre, it's always sort of difficult, similar in music, right? The way in which you might start with a certain, label, like it's alternative, right? And then over time, alternative evolves in so many different ways that you're like, I'm not sure. It seems to envelop a lot of different genres, right? And so I think with horror, one of the things that's interesting about it is that it does. There's so many people that I meet who say, "Oh, I don't like horror movies. I was like, oh, what did you think of the first Alien? And they're like, oh, I love it. And you're like, that's considered horror, right? And the dirty secret in Hollywood, what's the phrase? There's never a successful horror movie. And the reason is because once it's successful, it's now a thriller. Right.
Right.
So you rebrand it, right? Because you don't want the people to say, well, I don't watch horror movies. So a thriller. Yes, I will go. So how many people liked Jaws who would also say, I don't like horror movies? Right. And I think that's kind of I think that's kind of a reality of it. But I do think when it comes to horror, right, obviously there's sort of the obvious elements of it that it excites, right? That it creates these sort of tensions and these fears. But I think it also is inherent that it plays on some of, what what C.S. Lewis drawing on Rudolf Otto would call the numinous, right? This sense of something otherly that excites a sense of dread within us. And that sense of dread doesn't necessarily always mean fear, right? It can just mean this strange sense, as Lewis put it, I think it's in The Problem of Pain, where he talks about that we use words like fear in all sorts of different ways, right? And so we can talk about, I'm afraid of a rise in prices, right? Or, I'm afraid of losing my job or whatever it is. And he talked about how if you were told there was a tiger in the next room, you might experience fear, right? But if you're told there was a ghost in the next room and you believed it, you would experience something that we'd also call fear, but of a very different kind, right? And he points out that the fear you experience of a tiger actually is rational. It's logical, because you can move directly from what a tiger is to why it's physically dangerous to you. And yet when it comes to the fear that a ghost excites, you're merely afraid of the fact that it is a ghost, right? You're not primarily afraid of what it will do to you. And that tells you something, that there are certain things in human experience that are tethered to this sense of, dread of a certain kind, having to do with, the unknown, right? The monster that lives in the deep of the sea, right? It doesn't have to be paranormal, right? That's the thing that Jaws taps into. Or, whatever the monster might be that, we're worried about. And then there's obviously more overt forms of horror that move into things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or whatever. So you have this wide spectrum. I'll admit that for myself, the sort of area of horror that I'm interested in, I'm not interested in slasher projects or things like that. And I think it's primarily because what draws me to horror is actually that sense of the numinous, right? That sense of an encounter with something on the other side of the veil, or that deep childhood fear that you have of deep, dark waters, and you know not why, other than that, who knows what's down there, right? And I think those sorts of features, the things that are tapped into there in the human heart, I think are the things that most interest me in horror. And so that's the part that I'm most drawn to. Now, in terms of what makes for a good horror story, on the one hand, I think horror stories, a good horror story should follow certain general principles of good storytelling generally. So, for example, a well-constructed story, you should have a point of view, right? You should be able to say, whose story is it, right? And you should be able to answer that, right? Which character's story is it? And then once you've answered that question, it should be from that character's point of view. And you should not diverge from that point of view. And you should also be able to ask very clear questions about, like, what does this character want, right? And not in some abstract, like they want world peace or happiness, right? Like it needs to be tangible. They want to get out of the basement, right? Like it needs to be like something very clear and tangible. And that needs to seem easy at first. And it needs to get progressively more difficult. And they can't get what they want until the movie's over. Because once they get what they want, the movie's over. Right. And if you follow those general principles, you're immediately on the path to having a good, strong story in general. And those rules still apply to horror. I've mentioned to you that I think my criticisms of I always get, I know there's one movie, Heretic, and one, The Heretic. Which one is Hugh Grant? Is it The
Heretic.
Heretic?
Yeah.
It's Heretic with no definite article? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a film that I actually really love. And yet I also see a flaw in it based on just those principles that I mentioned. So I don't know if you want me to like sort of jump. I could use that as an example.
Please do.
As a
That'd be
possible.
great.
So I think it's a brilliant film. So this is me criticizing something that I love, right? I've watched that film quite a few times. And within that film, I think it's brilliant because I think it's brilliantly shot. I think everybody in it's brilliantly acted. And then even just production wise, it's brilliant in the sense of, that it's always wonderful when you can come up with a story that's so contained and yet so compelling, right? One location, this house, 3 people there. And that's it, right? Like, it's brilliant on that level. And then I think it's also brilliant because my take on the film is that it's actually not anti-religion. And yet everything that's said in the film, or virtually the majority of the things said about religion in the film are tropes that you can find online as anti-religion polemics, right? A lot of it being rubbish, right? Most of it being rubbish, but it nonetheless being a popular talking point. And so you could easily come away going, ugh, and, this is just an opportunity for Hollywood to bash religion and sort of, but I think the film is more subtle than that. I think it actually is pro-religion because in the end, am I allowed to do spoilers? There's going to be spoilers in what I'm going to critique here.
Sure, yeah. If anyone hasn't seen it yet, just cover your ears for this next 30 seconds.
Yeah. So, the very fact that what you end up having is that, Hugh Grant's character in the end ends up, he's the villain who ends up being proved wrong, and he ends up dying, and then you have this whole butterfly motif at the end, which seems to actually be obviously it's an obvious callback to the conversation earlier about if I were to die, I would come back and land on somebody's hand and all these sorts of things like that. And when I look at that, I'm like, that's actually vindicating the religious characters in the film that Hugh Grant was wrong. And so I think it's subtle and I think it's interesting in that way. But here's the thing I would critique about it. So when that film starts, if we pause that film after Act 1 or even into Act 2, and we ask the questions, whose story is it, right? You'd say the brunette, right? You're like, okay. And you'd say, yeah. And are they sticking with her point of view? And the answer is yes. Every single shot, it is the brunette's point of view. And do we know what the brunette wants? Yes, she wants to get out of that house. Okay. Yep. And is it getting progressively more difficult? Yep. Because originally it's just go walk out the door awkwardly. Right. And then it's like the door's locked and then we've got to go deeper into it. It's doing all the right things, right? Story wise.
Yeah.
But then what happens, and this is the spoiler. Okay. They can move ahead now since I've warned. The spoiler is, of course, that she gets her throat cut.
Yeah.
And then what happens is there is necessarily a shift in point of view. Now we're following the blonde. Why? Because the brunette's dead. And I think that's a major mistake. And I think it's a major mistake that probably happened in the writer's room in a way that I'll describe exactly what probably happened. Somebody was probably reading the script and it was probably written so that the blonde's throat gets cut. She's the one who gave the speech about the butterfly. The brunette goes ahead and scrutinizes everything that, Hugh Grant has said. And then the blonde comes back to life and kills Hugh Grant. And then the brunette crawls away out the window. And then the blonde, in the form of a butterfly, lands on her hand. Right? Like, that's probably the way it was written. But somebody in the writer's room said, problem is we've got 3 characters here and 2 are just so strong. And this one is just such a weak character in comparison. You know what I think we should do? We should have the brunette have her throat cut. And then let's give the lines from the brunette over to the blonde. And I'm pretty sure that's exactly what happened. I'm guessing. I'm just total guess. I don't know anybody who worked on that project, but that would be my guess. And the reason is because when you look at a script, well-written script, Every character has a voice, and you should be able to cover up the name on the script and tell who's talking without seeing the name. And the thing is, if you cover up the lines of the blonde in the second half of the film after the brunette has been killed, that's the brunette's voice. The blonde doesn't talk like that, right? Especially like she's giving a speech about prayer and prayer doesn't work, and this whole experiment. That's totally something the brunette would say. The blonde would never say that. That's not her character. And so that's where I'm looking at it. I'm like, I think this was a mistake. The way it was written, if I'm correct in my theory, the way it was written was the right way from the start. And it works, and it works great. But, because of that shift in point of view and the, and the traits, like the behaviors of the blonde that no longer actually match her character, but match the brunette instead, it's a major flaw in it. Now, the thing is, I think it's still such an excellent film that I'm kind of like try to ignore that flaw, even though I still want to use like AI and swap out their faces and like fix the film and watch it again the way it should be. But I do think those are some of the basic principles of storytelling that carry in everything. And this is actually one of the problems with one of the horror movie tropes. So I just recently watched, what is it called? The Watchers, right? And I don't know if you've seen that one, but where they're there's a forest out in the west of Ireland, and they end up stuck here and so on. Anyway, I don't need to go through the whole story because the point is simply this. One of the sort of horror movie tropes is like, oh, the monster is dead and the story is over. But the movie keeps going. And you're all sitting there going, why is the movie still going? And we all know why the movie's still going, because it's not really dead, right? Like, they were wrong, right? It's over, but is it? And I think that's actually a big mistake in horror movie tropes. It's a common trope, but I think it's actually a mistake of horror trope. Because, as I said, part of the way you string along an audience is that we've bonded with this character at the start. We know what they want. We want for them what they want. We're frustrated that it's getting harder and like more elusive. And when they get that, we relax and breathe and we're ready to turn off the movie. And so the idea that you would then go ahead and let's just extend the movie is actually a bad idea. And so it's a sort of campy, fun, like the monster's dead, or is it, right? Sort of thing that happens in horror films. That's actually a pretty terrible principle of storytelling. So I think there's that. And then beyond that, I think other elements that are sort of unique to horror is that horror has an opportunity for world building, mythology building. And I think that's one of the things that really excites me about it is that you have an opportunity to build very cool worlds, very cool universes, right? Oftentimes world building is thought of in a fantasy genre. And yet there's no reason that horror cannot be just as elaborate and intriguing and engrossing in terms of its own mythology as like a Tolkien type thing. I mean, obviously you're probably not going to do 3 very long, movies that are, back to back to make a single story. But in terms of the horror, in terms of the world building and the mythology, and the ability to create rules of the universe and things like that, I think those are all those are strengths of horror that stand out. And I'll just say one more thing, which is tied to the first thing that I had said about what draws me to it, which is that I do think there's something within human experience that we are drawn to stories about the numinous for very good reason. There's a reason why if you start to tell ghost stories around the fire, everyone's engrossed, right? There's a reason why if you tell people at camp that there's supposedly a thing that lives in that lake, right? They are engrossed in it. And it's because it grabs hold of this part of us that is attuned to the numinous, right? The idea that there's this other layer to reality that excites that sense of dread or awe. And I think the very fact that horror deals, or at least an aspect of horror, a subgenre within horror deals with those realities, I think makes for some very compelling storytelling if you can actually tap into that. Tap into those things that, that people start to feel and be intrigued by around Halloween, or when they hear a ghost story or whatever it might be. So I think that's a real strength of the genre, that if it can be done well and really excite that part of the person, grab that part of the person, I think that's one of its I think that's one of its main strengths.
Yeah, fascinating. Because I guess, as you say, moving into theological territory, why do these stories kind of rattle us so much? They must be tapping into something profound about our nature. It's funny what you were saying about atheists believing in ghosts a lot of the time. I remember seeing Hereditary in the cinema with one of my close friends, who's probably the staunchest atheist I know. And when we came out of it, he said, oh yeah, I'd never do a Ouija board or a seance or anything like that. And kind of fascinating, isn't it? It's
right.
Like,
why not? Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
It's just a bit of cardboard, right? And a plastic, whatever you call it. I forget what you call the thing on top of it, but yeah.
Right, exactly. But yeah, as you're saying, maybe these objects aren't just the materials they're made of.
Right.
There's a line, though, that I'd love to pick up on. So I don't know if you saw the recent Nosferatu film.
Oh, yeah, I
the
did.
remake. There's a line in that by, I've forgotten the name of the character, but she's played by Lily Rose Depp. And she says early on in the film, does evil come from within us or from beyond? And I heard that and I was like, that's such a fascinating question, because I suppose the Christian answer is kind of yes, isn't it?
Right.
There's a sense in which, evil is within the human heart. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart, as Solzhenitsyn says. And yet there is also this evil that is beyond us. I was wondering if you could tease out maybe how that works and the relationship between the two.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find so fascinating when looking at the concept of freedom or free will in the ancient world is just the language of it. So we're accustomed to talking about like free will, right? We use that term. And that term is actually a very late term. That's a bastardization of a Latin term. So the Latin term is liberum arbitrium, which is actually free choice. Voluntas would be the will. The will was the sort of part of you that does the choosing, right? And so the question of freedom had to do with whether your choices are free, right? And that's why it was a liberum arbitrium, but into English, it eventually becomes free will, as it's sort of clumsily handed down. But when you look at the Greek of it, it's very interesting that the language is a bit different. Obviously, it's a different language, right? But in the Greek, it's basically autoekousia, right? Like it's essentially like ekousia would be like it would be governance, right? And so this is, on the one hand, self-governance, but yet on the other hand, like the etymology of like ek and ousia is actually, those two terms collapsed are out of the substance. And so there's a sense in which etymologically the talk of freedom is self-substancing, right? Like determining what you become is what it actually is. And so that's a fascinating thing that it's so overtly ontological in the framing of it, because what it's essentially acknowledging amongst the ancients in this sort of language is it's acknowledging that a plant doesn't make any choices. It just sort of begins to grow and develop into whatever it is, right? And animals do the same thing. Bees don't diverge from the pattern. They sort of do what bees do. And yet, with regard to humans, rational beings, we have this very strange capacity to look at the structure of the world, reflect on the fact that we are human beings, determine what a human being ought to do, and then maybe not do it. And like nothing else in all of the cosmos does that. And it is such a bizarre phenomenon. And that bizarreness, though, is the thing that's so intriguing, is that we are inherently developmental beings who have a hand in what we develop into. We get to self-determine in some way. And so what's intriguing is, like, obviously within the ancient world in general, there was always this sort of question of this polarity because there was a recognition of good and evil, right, within the world. And sometimes some people would like to chalk it up to just pleasure and pain, like the Epicureans, who were basically atheist materialists, who are like, oh, we just call pleasant things good and unpleasant things bad or evil. But the majority of the ancient world was like, no, I think there actually is like a moral polarity between good and evil within the world. And the most common, tact in trying to explain that was a substantive reality. Like either there are two gods, one who is good and one who is evil, who is one who's source of good and harmony and one who is the source of corruption and wickedness. Or it's that there's two principles. Matter is inherently corrupting and spirit is good. And so the line that you referred to that runs through us is because we're this composite of something that's corruptive, right? And pesky and resistant to good things, which is matter. And then we've got the spirit that is good. But the very unique thing that emerged within Christianity was the idea that nothing is originally evil, right? That evil is always a twisting or distortion of something that is originally good. And so you can see this in the sense that, like ontologically, when you think about like just parts of your body, for example, your eye, is a seeing organ. And so anything that moves it toward proper formation and sight, well, that would be for its good. And if you gash it and you harm it in a way that it can't see, well, that would be an evil to the eye. And those are meaningful terms, right? You're talking about ontological realities of good and evil for it. But the Christians noted that, gashing your eye is an additive, right? It's subtractive, it's privative. And they tended to see the same thing in virtues. So within the pagans, there was already in people like Plato and Aristotle a recognition that the virtues have a certain unity to them. So the four sort of chief pagan virtues are, justice and wisdom and temperance and courage. And those are your four pagan chief virtues. And what they noticed is that if the virtues are lopsided, they become vices. So let's take courage as a simple example. It's easy enough to think of courage as just this simple sort of thing that's like, yeah, you don't want to be the sniveling guy in the corner because that's a coward, right? And that's true, right? Like that's true. You don't want to be that. That is a good example of cowardice. However, one of the problems that you actually run into is that the person who just decides, I fear no danger, and they pull a Leroy Jenkins, right? They run full on into, battle without any regard for themselves or those around them. Well, that's actually not courage, right? That's bullheaded folly. And why, right? What is the difference? Well, the difference is that is, yes, the root of what we call courage, but it lacks wisdom. It even lacks justice, right? In terms of if the people around you are owed certain duties, or even the duty to render to the danger its appropriate due. There's something that's grown lopsided about that. Similarly, like when you think about temperance, right? Like on the one hand, it's very common to talk about like the need for temperance to like not be a glutton or to be a complete hedonist with regard to sexuality or something like that. But at the same time, to be overly temperate to the point that you're prudish is also flawed. And so this is one of the reasons why there was this recognition that the virtues actually are in some ways a unity. And if you start to create a deprivation of something, right, you lack wisdom, for example, all of a sudden what would be a virtue turns into a vice, right? And so the Christians notice this as just the pattern that whenever you're talking about why a person does a thing, they're always drawn to the good in it, right? I enjoy power. Well, power actually is a good, right? Or it makes me feel good. Well, pleasure is a good, right? Or, it eases pain. That also is a good, right? Like there's all these sorts of things that can be named in terms of like why you're doing the thing. It's just that it ends up being distorted in some way because it's pleasure with the disregard of the other person or whatever it might be, right? And so with the Christians, they started to notice that that evil is always a privation of a good, a twisting of something that would otherwise be good. And so the reason that's important to understand is because it's not seen as like there are two things that are both possible pathways. And it's just, is it this one or is it this one? Right. Instead, what they see is there is the good of the thing, to be formed in this certain way. And I can embrace that fully, or I can diverge from it. And when I diverge from it, there's some sort of deprivation that takes place. There's a twisting or a corrupting that's there. And so evil is never seen as an additive thing. People aren't evil for evil's sake. They're evil because that evil gives them some genuine, desirable thing, that they want. But that good, desirable thing has been disjointed or ripped out of the context of all the other things, all the other goods that it should be conjoined to. And that's where you get the horrible deprivation. And like I said, in the context of like gluttony, it's obvious what it is, right? Whatever it might be, the good of food, of satiating hunger, the pleasure that might come with it, if it's an ending of pain, whatever it is. But obviously what you're seeing is it's so out of control, it's so disproportionate to what those things should be, that it's leading to a series of other things such as obesity and ill health and isolation and whatever it might be. And so that sort of concept that we really do choose things because of the good that we see in them, but we choose them in a distorted way that is sort of lacking the other surrounding goods that are required to make us whole, I think is a critical concept that's very uniquely Christian. And yet that concept is paired with another concept that's very prominent within Christian thought, especially within Eastern Christian thought, which is that we are inherently developmental beings. And so I'll speak here from within the Eastern Church Fathers' perspective, since I'm Eastern Orthodox. One of the things that they notice within the book of Genesis is that God says, let us make man in our own image according to our own likeness. And then he makes man in his own image, and likeness isn't repeated. And they take that omission to be important and intentional. And the reason is because they see image as that inherent capacity, right? That we are rational, free beings. We're fully capable of imitating God and becoming virtuous. And when deciding what we are to become, making ourselves something good. But at the same time, we are not yet that, right? And that's the likeness part. And so there is a recognition that the likeness is actually the active imitation of God. So that is actually the active working out of those sorts of things. And so within the Eastern Fathers, they don't look at the Adam and Eve story, and they don't see Adam and Eve as perfect and things we're trying to get back to. They see them as uncorrupted, yes, right? Sin hasn't set in. They haven't been twisted or distorted in any way. But they're also not what man is made to become. They're just sort of set in this place where they can take that pathway. And the thing that's really intriguing about that is that we have to, in some ways, participate in our own creation, right? Like according to the Eastern Fathers, when they look at this, God cannot make a virtuous creature. And the reason he can't make a virtuous creature is because virtue is something that has to be actively brought about by a free being. So he can make a creature who's uncorrupted and capable of virtue, but the creature actually has to contribute and cooperate to become virtuous. And so free beings of the kind that we are, or the kind that the angels are beings who are self-determining because we're incomplete, because we're developmental, because our creation is not just unilateral like with a plant. God can form us, he can direct us, he can offer support to guide us, but we have to cooperate in our own making and choose to actually be properly formed. And that fact is the fact that opens the door for us to self-determine in twisted and distorted ways. And then, as I said, within the within the Christian view, those twisted and distorted ways are not actually because we're choosing evil. We're just choosing good in a myopic sense. And so it's interesting that, Basil of Caesarea he was asked once in one of, he wrote these sort of moral guides, these moral rules. And he was asked, like, could you teach us to love God? And his answer was no, because you already do. And what Basil meant, as he goes on, is that God is the good. And every good you encounter in creation is a refraction of that good. And when you are drawn to that thing, you pick the pleasure of food, right? You pick the pleasure of sex. You pick safety and cutting yourself off the world because you want to protect yourself, right? You choose to be mean because you want to, feel powerful and not feel diminished in these sorts of ways. All of these things have some sort of good root to them. There is some good that you recognize about being strong or about being whole or about being safe or about being pleased or about being bonded, whatever it is. But the problem is we don't recognize that those goods actually have their source in God. And as a result, we choose them in myopic and distorted ways. And this is where, people like Basil of Caesarea and others, Pseudo-Dionysius, talk about spiritual simplicity, where a critical feature of spiritual wholeness is recognizing that all of these disparate goods have a common source and they are all harmonious, but that also means they all have to be brought together in a proper proportion and balanced together. Because when they're not, that's when you get the twisting that gets you, the distortion of gluttony or debauchery or whatever it might be. And so when looking at, the sort of evil, when we're talking about evil in the human heart, what we're really talking about is the fact that we have this sort of myopic view. And the very fact that we are developmental beings who can shape ourselves into something puts us in a position where in that myopia, we can begin to elevate and obsess over certain things in self-destructive ways. I mean, you can see this in a basic way in relationships, right? Like, one of the things that people who've focused on emotional bonds between people have noted is the fact that relationships end up spiraling in ways that reflect fight and flight instincts, right? And the reason is because I need love, like it actually is a biological need, in which they came to the conclusion of on the basis of failure to thrive, where orphans would have all their physical needs met, but not the emotional needs and would still die. And so the thing is, if I'm in a relationship and somebody is not giving me the love that I want, that's actually a threat to me on the level of taking my food away from me. And that's why what kicks in is your survival instinct. And so that's why people tend to attack if they're a fight instinct person, or they freeze out and retreat if they're a flight instinct. But the thing is, nothing could be more toxic to your relationship than the fight or the flight, right? Like, the most important thing in repairing the relationship is actually to put that instinct in check and be vulnerable and open up and, engage with whatever the issue is in a more direct way. And yet that instinct is there for a good reason, to protect you, to help you survive, right? But that's sort of the nature of what we deal with all the time, is that we as developmental beings who have a deep need of various sorts also have a certain myopia where we can start to pursue a certain good in a way that's utterly destructive to us. And, that relationship example is one such example, right? I want to protect myself, so I'm going to attack this person, even though what I'm doing is actually perpetuating the very problem that I'm facing, which is destroying the relationship. And so that seems to be, if I were to diagnose what's going on within the human heart. But there's this other dimension of this, which you mentioned, is the evil from within, or is it from without? And I'll just speak to an aspect of, Eastern Christian thought and the Eastern Church Fathers that I think is really interesting on this point. within the Eastern Church Fathers, they have this concept of what's called energia, right? And this is a term that shows up a lot in the New Testament. It's lost in translation. It originates in Aristotle, develops in Alexandrian Judaism, shows up in the New Testament, then shows up in the Eastern Church Fathers. And I'll skip the entire history of it, but suffice it to say that they drew a distinction between the nature of the thing and the outward expressions or articulations or operative powers of that thing. So, for example, fire, right? The nature of fire is one thing, and we could talk about the abstract, nature of fire, but the articulation of that nature happens when it burns something, right? Like that is an outward expression. And one of the concepts that emerged in Alexandrian Judaism, then the New Testament, then the Fathers, was that they recognized that in some cases, the energies or operative powers of a thing are transferable. And so they like to use the example of if you put iron in fire, it begins to glow and it begins to burn. And that what begins to happen is you can take it out of there, right? You can take the iron out and it's still glowing and burning. And so the point is to say that there's been some sort of transference. The energies of fire that express that nature have been communicated to the metal so that they are now resident within it. And that actually gave rise to the concept of synergy, right? So if you've ever heard of synergy, that's actually it's drawn from the word energia, right? So it's two energies in a single act. And so you might think of like a branding iron where you heat it up and then you carry it over to a cow and you burn it. Well, what's burning the cow, the iron or the fire, right? And the answer is, well, both, right? The fire is what's providing the burning energies, right? Because that's its nature, not the nature of iron. But iron is what has those within it and is carrying it over and is determining the shape of it and all that sort of stuff. Now, all of that's a long sort of background in order to say that some of the ways in which they thought about our world, and this was actually critical to the horror project They Dwell Among Us, it was sort of the central thesis of it, is that I think for a lot of us who have a materialist worldview, who are born out of modernity, we tend to think of our world as spiritually neutral. There's nothing spiritual about it. It's just matter, right? And there's nothing spiritual about matter. And then spirituality, if it's real, if they're spirits, they just kind of invade sometimes and they show up as additional things. But for the most part, you're in a neutral space. Whereas it's certainly in the Alexandrian world, they didn't think like that. They thought you are living and breathing and swimming in a spiritual space. And you are spiritually an open system who is porous, who is imbibing that. The same way if the air that I'm breathing is toxic, it will affect me. Or the food I'm eating is toxic, it'll affect me. Or it's healthy and it's, vivifying. That's the nature of your spiritual world too. You are surrounded by it all the time. And you are porous and you are imbibing it. And that imbibing will affect you on a spiritual level. And so far from seeing you as a closed system who just has free will and it's just my choices about do I do good, do I do bad, do I do right, do I do wrong, what they saw is that your free choices, that self-determination, carries with it a self-determination that is inherently either cooperating with God or cooperating with something in rebellion with God. And so far from seeing like my life as a series of choices, most of which are not spiritual and some of which are spiritual, I saw everything you're doing as inherently spiritual. That how I conduct myself day to day in the ordinary things is me either cooperating with God or cooperating with the demons who are in rebellion against God because I'm starting to rebel against God too. And obviously that's on a spectrum, right? You have this concept of demoniacs who sort of lose themselves to being energized by demons. And you have saints, right? And prophets who are energized by God in this sort of extreme form. But they saw that as part of a continuum, right? Part of a spectrum that says, look, whenever I begin to engage in viciousness and overt rebellion against God, I am cooperating with the part of the world that's cancerous, and it's going to negatively impact me. And yet the pathway to healing is the same, right? The moment I decide to repent and I turn back to God and I cooperate with him, I am opening myself up to something else that's good, right? And they didn't really see that. And I think it's one of the reasons that you see in pagan literature, like why there's a concept of a muse, right? When it's not just, it's not just ordinary activity, right? When I'm writing poetry or whatever it might be, right? That there are these spiritual elements to even these most basic activities that the human engages in. So that's a very long, very theological answer. And hopefully I didn't lose, 90% of the audience over the course of that, by which I mean not, conceptually, I mean attention-wise, but that's all I got.
No, thanks for sharing that. That's absolutely fascinating. So everything we do and think, I guess, is resonating spiritually with something, and that could be God or it could be something else.
Right. Yeah.
That's super helpful.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is, because I think a lot of times people, obviously there's something ominous about that, but there's also something I find very hopeful or vivifying, which is to say, a lot of times people are like, man, I feel spiritually sick or depressed or distant from God, or I wish I could do something. And the problem is, if the do something means I've got to go find a church to walk into, because ordinary life is not spiritual, right? There's something about that it leaves you lost, going, how do I even begin? And with the Eastern Fathers, right, they always talk about the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me. They're like, the moment you do that, like, you're already, turned back to God and imbibing him, right? Like, it's not something that takes this go on a lengthy pilgrimage to start. You immediately turn to the person next to you and you begin to show them love and kindness as an act of repentance, and simple things. And lo and behold, you're cooperating with God. So it's exceedingly practical.
Yeah, and it's embodied, isn't it? It's not that it's just about trying to correct the mindset in our heads. If you actually start to do these physical things, because that goes hand in hand with the meaning.
Right.
Saying those words, they're not just words.
Right.
It's not just vibrations that are being made by your throat. That's actually getting in touch with a spiritual heartbeat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Well, can we move on to Satan himself?
Sure.
Because this is I realize that this is a proper deep dive here. I'm very grateful to you being willing to talk about all this stuff. But he strikes me as a very complex figure, even within the Bible, because the word Satan in the Hebrew occurs 27 times in the Old Testament, I think. And it's not a proper noun. I'm sure you know it's...
Right.
I don't know why I'm telling you this, but for the sake of the audience, I suppose it's simply a word that means something like a persecutor or opposer. And so it's used of humans throughout the Old Testament. It's even used of God. So when the angel of the Lord stands before Balaam on the donkey, it says that the angel of the Lord was standing there as his Satan, which is kind of fascinating. So you don't get an obvious sense from the Old Testament that there is this one kind of big bad called the devil or Satan. You do get glimmers. So there's the serpent in Genesis 3, who we can maybe talk about who that is. There's Isaiah 14 talking about the wicked king of Babylon, and it seems to describe his fall in cosmic terms and talk about this morning star that has fallen. There's Ezekiel 28 doing a similar thing with the king of Tyre and talking about an anointed guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden who became proud and then was cast to the ground. So it's talking about this human king, and yet it seems to be giving a window to some kind of angelic fall. There's Job's adversary who's called a Satan, who attends the divine council. And So I suppose, are these all referring to the same figure, or are they referring to multiple figures? And then why is it that 400 years later you get to the New Testament and it seems to be very clear that there is this one big bad called the devil? First John says the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. So it's kind of fascinating, isn't it, that it's maybe not obvious from the Old Testament that there is a devil, or one kind of devil who's in this fight against God. But then you get this proliferation throughout the intertestamental period of demonology and Satanology, to the point that, bam, Jesus shows up, he's casting out demons left, right, and center, and he's very much seeing it as a core part of his quest, that he is going to overcome the devil. So there's a lot there, but what would you say is going on with all of that and that trajectory?
Yeah. So it is interesting because, again, to hearken to C.S. Lewis, he talked about how the first time he ever he was struck by how when he first started reading the New Testament, how dualistic it seemed, meaning like a war between a good God and an evil God. Now, he qualifies that, of course, the uniqueness of the Christian vision that all things are created good, and the devil and that includes the devil, who then becomes twisted and becomes evil. So he recognized that it wasn't pure metaphysical dualism in the way that some of the polarities of the ancient world I described earlier, like Gnosticism or Manichaeism would be. But he was struck by how prominent it is. As you put it, Christ is casting out demons left, right, and center. And I would also actually point out here, I'll amplify that side of things by drawing on the church fathers, specifically the Eastern church fathers. So it's interesting that a lot of folks today, due to the influence of, people like Anselm, and then if you're Protestant, Jonathan Edwards, or, whoever it might be, there's this heavy emphasis on penal substitutionary atonement and the idea that the cross itself is actually about God the Father and the judicial predicament we face with regard to Christ. But the majority of the church fathers don't see it that way. They actually, one of the more common things that you saw was the idea of the cross in some ways serving this sort of ransom theory, having to do with ransoming us from the devil and breaking the hold of that. And so it's interesting that specifically when you look at the Eastern church fathers, you have one of these themes having to do with, two characters are prominent, Hades and the devil. Hades is also a pretty prominent character within Eastern literature. And within, the New Testament, yes, Hades is sometimes a place, but it's also anthropomorphized, like in the book of Revelation, when it vomits up its dead and then is later cast into the lake of fire. That's an anthropomorphized monster called Hades that swallows men. And you see it in ancient Christian iconography, where if you see the icon of the Last Judgment, there's what's sometimes called the hell mouth that's often the lower corner vomiting up the dead. But it's actually not the hell mouth, it's Hades. And if you look at early Christian literature, like something like the Gospel of Nicodemus, which wasn't, considered, it's literature, right? It's not considered scripture, it's not considered authoritative, but it still gives you a glimpse into certain things that early Christians thought. There's a conversation between Hades and Satan in preparation for the crucifixion of Christ. And it's a fantastic conversation because the devil comes to Hades and he's like, I'm bringing you someone, right? And I want you to prepare yourself to receive this man, Jesus. And Hades asks the devil, he's like, is this the same Jesus who has deprived me of other men, referring to people like Lazarus? And the devil says, it is. And he goes, I implore you by my might and by yours, do not bring this man to me. And the reason is because as much as, we in the West are familiar with the crucifixion and the resurrection as these two critical things to the Christian gospel, Christ's descent into Hades was a critical aspect. It was commemorated on Holy Saturday. It's still commemorated in the Eastern Church on Holy Saturday as equally critical. And the reason was, and it's reflected in Chrysostom's Paschal homily, his Easter homily, where he talks about Hades being vexed because it takes into itself a man and encounters God and things like that. And the reason is because so much of Eastern Christianity sees our cosmos in some ways like an organism. And sin and corruption, the sort of twisting that I referred to, is kind of like a cancer that's spreading through the cosmos. So if we think of the fall of man as we are a critical feature of the cosmic organism, but we become cancerous. What the incarnation, how it was seen in the Eastern Fathers, is that the Son of God, who has the immortal, incorruptible life of God within him, enters into that cancerous organ in order to heal it and then drive back that infection, what Lewis calls the good infection that starts to spread throughout the cosmos. And part of that is what they see in Christ touching the unclean, right? And all of a sudden they become clean and the leprosy flees from them and things like that. But that's also how they understood the waters, right? What is Christ making perfect, right? Or fulfilling? Well, it's not that he needs to be purified by the waters, but he descends into the waters, which the waters were always symbols of chaos and of demonic powers, Leviathan, these sorts of things. And so in descending, he purifies the waters and crushes the head of Leviathan, is what it actually says in the theophany, literature, hymnody about this, or rite concerning the purification of the waters. And he purifies the waters rather than being purified by the waters. And this becomes the basis for holy water, right? And how it's thought of in that sense. And so it was in descending into Hades, into the realm of the dead, where death reigns over humanity. He enters, and by entering into the realm of the dead, he who cannot be infected by death brings life to that and bursts Hades and spreads life to all the dead and then robs Hades of humanity. That's how they read, for example, there's the part in the Gospels where Christ talks about how you can't ransack a man's house unless you first bind the strong man, right? And then you can take his stuff, right? That was always read as the strong man is the devil and his house is Hades. And Christ is going to go bind the strong man and ransack his house, which is Hades, and rob him of men. And that's why in the resurrection icons within the Christian East, you'll see that there's this cave that Christ is coming out of, which is supposed to be representative of Hades. Yes, it's his tomb, but it's really more so representative of Hades. And inside of it, you'll oftentimes see in certain forms of the icons shattered chains and things like that with the devil bound. And then Christ is raised with all of humanity, right? You see all of humanity there with him, having been pulled out of Hades. So I say all that in order to say that the entire demonic scheme, and actually let me amplify this. So I'm actually bolstering here the role of the devil in ways that are maybe not obvious to a lot of people. Most who come from a Protestant background, and probably many who come from a Catholic background, aren't always familiar with a lot of the stories about Mary, the traditions about Mary. But within the traditional stories about Mary, she was actually, she was given to the temple at age 3, similar to the way, you'd have like Samuel, he was given over when he was a child. And she was given over, and there were a number of maidens that was not something that was unique to her, but because she was this sort of miraculous gift, at age 3, she was given over to the temple and so on. And then when she's coming of age, meaning she's going to bleed, and that's not allowed in the temple, right? They need to figure out what to do with her. And this is where Gabriel shows up, and he tells the priests that, gather the maidens of Israel, and we'll signal who you're supposed to be with, and so on. And then they gather the widowers of Israel, and we'll signal who you're supposed to give Mary to. And Joseph is amongst them. This is how his children, like St. James, are understood to be his children from prior marriage. And then this dove descends and lands on his staff, and he's like, "You're the one." Well, the one for what? The one to marry this 12-year-old. And Joseph's scandalized, like, what? And now, the reason I bring that up is not so much to talk about Mary, but because one of the things you see throughout the Eastern Church Fathers consistently, and even many of the Latin ones, is that the reason Mary was given a husband was to hide her from the devil. And so one of the natural questions is, if you're going to have a virgin conceive and have a kid, why does she need to have a husband? And their answer is because the devil knows the prophecies and he's watching the maidens of Israel to see where the Messiah is going to come from. And as a ruse to hide her from the devil, she's given to Joseph. That was the consistent patristic understanding of why she was betrothed. That's why Joseph isn't actually seen as her husband. He's betrothed to her. He's the betrothed of Mary, because within patristic tradition, they never came together, right? This was all a ruse just in order to provide her protection from the devil. And that's why then they flee. And then you see the devil exciting people like Herod and things like that, and them having to flee because the infants are, being slaughtered and so on. And so throughout from the start of the gospel narrative, how the Eastern Fathers see it is that the devil is there as a character who is well aware of what the plan is. That there's a Messiah coming and he's watching for it. And the virgin birth and the betrothal has to do with hiding them. And then what you see in somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, for example, I mentioned the role of the cross. One of the things that Gregory talks about is that Christ is, veiled in flesh, right? So he is the Son of God. And yet what happens is, he talks about how as those divine energies begin to manifest in the person, the demons start to figure out who he is, that he is the Son of God in flesh. And this is what's sometimes referred to as the fishhook theory, which is that Gregory of Nyssa thinks that the manifestations of the divine glory in Christ are intentionally tempting the devil to take a bite and basically say, maybe now that he's in flesh, I can kill him. And even though the ruse is, like the mistake is to say, that's going to be your undoing. Take him into Hades. In the Gospel of Nicodemus, Hades is correct. Don't bring him to me. That will be our undoing. And yet the devil can't help himself because, this is his one shot to try to kill God, right? And there you have it, right? But it ends up being his undoing. And he loses all that he had in his house, which is to say humanity. And he ends up undermining his own power and binding himself and so on. And you see this theme throughout so many of the Eastern Fathers, right? Like angels are referred to in ancient texts as aerial spirits. And so by that, they mean they live in the air because they're not bodies, right? They're not fleshly bodies. So they're not terrestrial. They're celestial, or they're aerial spirits. And so just like I talked about when Christ descends into the waters to crush the heads of the demonic powers and purify the waters, so Athanasius in On the Incarnation talks about Christ being lifted up into the air, right, as Moses lifted up the serpent, and the demons being cast down because he purifies the air. And him being lifted up into the aerial realm, he also, casts down the demons. And so these themes are very thick, not only in the New Testament itself, but if you pair the New Testament with how the church fathers are reading the New Testament, the devil is an extraordinarily prominent figure. Now, I think the question, one way of reframing your question is, is this character even there in the Old Testament, right? Like demons seem to be so prominent. But are they, are they in the Old Testament at all, right? As you pointed out, we've got accusers, right? Or, persecutors, but, is that really the Satans, that we get, later if we're talking about the book of Enoch, the Satans, or, is this the devil, right, of the New Testament or whatever it might be? And I think the thing is, when we look at the Old Testament, it's probably more prevalent than we think. And one thing that immediately should be a consideration is, like Paul says explicitly that the gods of the pagans are demons. And the question of, are there any other gods mentioned in the Old Testament? The answer is, yeah, there's a whole lot of them mentioned throughout the Old Testament. And in keeping with St. Paul and even the Old Testament prophets, right, these are no gods at all, not because they don't exist, but because they're demons. They're celestial beings who have been given care over certain parts of the cosmos. And rather than actually nurturing that toward, proper formation, they're corrupting it, right? And they're leading it into all manner of wickedness. And so I think automatically, once you start to recognize that, you immediately have a lot more demonic activity in the Old Testament, given the war of the gods that's there, than you would immediately recognize. And then I think there's a whole lot of other subtle stuff that you find within there. There's all these sort of agents of chaos within the Old Testament, and the chaotic waters is one such example. And this was not just in Hebrew literature where, the water is associated with chaos. I think is it in the Babylonian myth where you have, basically Tiamat, right? Who is the god of the chaotic waters, who ends up being subdued by, the son of the sky god Anu, which is Marduk. Right. And there's a war between, where he takes the four winds and he goes down and he fires an arrow into Tiamat's gullet and her dead body becomes the dry land. And so that seems to be sitting there in the background of the Hebrew in Genesis when the Spirit of God hovers over the surface of the deep. The word deep is Tihom, which is an awful lot like Tiamat. And so Genesis does this a lot where it sort of hints at other ancient Near Eastern myths, kind of doing, well, you've heard it said, but I say to you, sort of thing. God doesn't go to war with the chaotic waters. He breathes on them with his spirit and he calms them. And nonetheless, you have these, things like Leviathan that are there. And you seem to have this ongoing sort of agent of chaos that is sort of runs throughout the Old Testament in terms of trying to twist and distort things. And obviously the serpent within Genesis is the first example of this, where there is certain intentions for creation that are then being sort of twisted and redirected. And if we carry that thread and we watch that sort of twisting and that redirecting away from proper formation, that God's perpetually working to sort of take a people for himself and reshape in a way that's purifying certain lands and driving away abominations and things like that, you start to see the Old Testament in a very different fashion, where what you begin to see, if you take, for example, the Nephilim as examples of, these sort of abominations that are perpetuated upon the earth because of fallen spirits, and those abominations reach to a point where God has to wipe them off the face of the planet. And then you follow the purification of the land of Canaan. It's interesting that if you follow those threads, you start to see, again, the giants as part of that, that thematic, that entire theme of the land of Canaan and what's being driven out. It's naming specific practices of black magic, practices of, sexual perversions, and also with this, of course, idolatry of a specific kind. And so when you start to look at this narrative, now what you're saying is, okay, so in this sense, the choosing of a people and giving of them the land and sending in the land in order to drive out certain abominations actually has to do with the very same thing that you see in the New Testament, which is that there's something that's become cancerous within our world, a cancer that's spreading and being perpetuated by agents of that, right? Namely the demons. And God's goal in this is to go ahead and drive away the cancer. And you see the preparatory work of that through the people of Israel when they're driving away those cancers, aiming at sort of moving toward this people that's ultimately going to bring about the Messiah, who will definitively then actually heal the cosmos. And I think if you look at it in that sense, then what you can begin to see is, even though it's not as clear that you have a singular, the devil, right, in the Old Testament, the way you would find in the New Testament, you still find all of the same sort of thematic trends that are actually quite ubiquitous throughout the Old Testament, if you know where to look for them, as well as a bunch of different things. Like a lot of ancient Near Eastern scholars are now noticing names of different demons from the ancient world in passages that seem benign, passages like when, talking about sin crouching at your door, like a common, thing within ancient Near Eastern literatures. That's a reference to a specific demon. Anyway, those are things that are kind of ubiquitous. So that's a very sort of broad way of addressing that question.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you. And the serpent is a fascinating figure, isn't he? As you say, as the first kind of agent of chaos from kind of the fringes of the garden, who distorts what Eve's saying, and then it kind of escalates and escalates. And then I'm always reminded to bring it into conversation with horror films. Every horror film has one place that's off limits, one spell that should not be said, or one room that you shouldn't go into. And you're screaming at the characters, don't go there. But what do? They press the self-destruct button, and you get exactly the same feeling, don't you? Reading Genesis 3, that there's a kind of clearly marked. Well, we could maybe talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because I've heard a lot of Eastern Orthodox people say, and I think this is fascinating, that God might well have let Adam and Eve take from that tree eventually. That knowledge of good and evil isn't in itself a bad thing. In fact, King Solomon is described as having knowledge of good and evil. And actually in the new creation, there's a tree of life, but there's not a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's not that that gets locked back up in a fruit in heaven. But that kind of cat is out of the bag, and maybe humanity was always meant to have knowledge of good and evil, but on God's terms rather than our terms. So maybe the problem is they grasp from it prematurely under the temptation of the serpent. But yeah, Protestants, I guess, would always say, oh yeah, that serpent is the devil. I've heard people like Jonathan Peugeot question that assumption, which I think has been quite helpful. But what would you make of, say, Revelation 12, talking about the dragon being hurled down to earth? And verse 9, it says that great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. I guess Protestants look at that and go, oh, there we go. Finally, it's confirmed that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was in fact the devil. But what would you make of that?
So let me start with the entire notion about whether or not the knowledge of good and evil is inherently bad. I'm aware of those who have basically advocated for a reading, which I think is generally correct, that even though the Book of Enoch is not, scripture within the Eastern, Orthodox Church, it still is something that gives you, and it informs you about certain traditions that were floating about in the air. And one of the things that you really see within that literature is the idea that basically the Watchers, right, these angels who had rebelled, it's not that they're necessarily teaching humanity things that are inherently bad. In some cases, it does seem so that there's some sort of judgment about, obviously magic or something like that. All right. But it's not obvious that everything that they're instructing them in, such as metalworking, is inherently evil. And so in some ways, one of the analogies I think that's sometimes drawn is it's kind of like, it's not that children should never be allowed to use knives. It's just that they need to be, they need to grow up and become mature to a point that they can actually handle that in a proper way. And I think the proof of this, the sort of strongest proof of this, is something that you find in Genesis, which is the very fact that when the devil is, sort of tempting, he's talking about you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And of course, we, reading him as a liar, have a tendency to be like, see, he's lying. But God, when the Trinity has a conversation afterwards, they've become like us, knowing good and evil. That ends up being true, actually. And so it's an interesting thing to be like, well, wait a second. So is the knowledge of good and evil bad, or is it not bad? And I think the answer is it's bad when a creature is not yet properly formed. And so I talked about that, right? I talked about this whole self-formation, and that man is made in the image of God, but he's not yet the thing that he's made to become. He's supposed to move into some form of maturity and grow up into the likeness of God. And that hasn't happened. And so now the knowledge of good and evil, without that underlying formation, becomes very destructive, right? And this is, I think, at least one of the ways in which, it makes sense that man, having now gone through the much longer road of formation, it's still the same plan, right? The intention for man is still the same that it was before. It's just that it's now a much longer, harder, messier road than it would have been had you taken the straight path there. And yet still the intent is, to get us there, albeit with pain and suffering and all the rest. There's actually certain prayers within the Eastern Orthodox Church that talk about, us having cast ourselves down and yet God not abandoning us, but deciding to remake us and in fact better. And in some ways suggesting that God drawing us up from this sort of longer road, having undergone the sort of things that will undergo as a result, actually in some ways makes man better as a result, for having gone through that than had he never gone through it in the first place. But so I think that's part of what sits there in the background when people have suggested that the knowledge of good and evil isn't inherently bad. In terms of the devil as, the serpent, you mentioned Revelation. Obviously, there's ties being pulled in from St. Paul as well, when he's talking about Eve being deceived and so on. But really looking at the Eastern Church Fathers, when I went through, combed through all of their angelology, it was interesting to find that it was just generally ubiquitous, first of all, that they believed in a devil. Second of all, that they had the assumption that was there, that was pretty well known, that he's a fallen angel. There were disparate opinions about whether or not he was a cherub or, is he a different type of angel, right? Like the type of angel he was is actually disputed. Was he an archangel? Was he a cherub? Is disputed amongst the Eastern Fathers. They don't all agree. And exactly when the fall takes place is actually also something they disagree about. And in some ways, basically because of, I think it's largely because of in Wisdom of Solomon, the devil is referred to as falling. It talks about because of envy, I think it is. And so they take that in some ways to be actually the sort of thing that C.S. Lewis hints at in the Screwtape Letters, when Screwtape is talking about that disgusting hybrid that God decided to make, right? This disgusting hybrid between animals and spirits. And he says in there in this one line, that I'm sure Lewis must be alluding to this tradition, is that, and the enemy's resolution to do that, referring to God, in the case of the Screwtape Letters, is one of the things that incited our Father below to rebel, right? That there is in some ways recognizing that he is going to make the centerpiece of creation this thing that's lower than us, and we're going to have to bow the knee to that? No, right? Like, and that is, and I think that's reflective of an intertestamental development in terms of the thinking that's there, and that then just becomes ubiquitous amongst the fathers themselves. And I think that is one of the things that then factors into the sort of traditions that you have about who the devil is, and then the association with the serpent in Eden, for example, and the deception of Eve and so on. So I mean, those are just some elements to it.
Yeah, because it's interesting to compare Christianity to the paganism that came before it, isn't it? In terms of these notions of good and evil ending, although you talk about a gradation, they are concrete realities in the sense of you can say that something is genuinely good, and if something is evil, it is genuinely a privation of that good. And it's just interesting looking back at, in pre-Christian times, lots of the paganisms did have some gods that were more fearsome than others, but thinking about them in terms of good and evil, those weren't really categories that they used. So the Babylonians had a god called Zu, who was pretty fearsome, this kind of storm god, and looks terrifying in his depictions. but they wouldn't have thought of him as their devil or something like that. That, you know, he would have just been Zeus. And, you know, Homer writing in the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's not much distinction between Theos and Daemon. All men and all gods kind of have destructive properties, and in a sense, the gods in Greco-Roman theology aren't so much supernatural or as maybe supranatural. They're kind of heightened versions of us.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on. So Heraclitus, I hope I've said that right. Heraclitus, maybe. Yeah, ancient Greek philosopher, and he said, all things are beautiful, good, and right. Men, on the other hand, deem some things wrong and some things right, and kind of is good and evil a matter of human opinion. And what's fascinating is pairing that with Justin Martyr in the first century, who says a quote that feels very kind of relevant in a lot of ways. We'll see if I can find it. He says, the worst evil of all is to say that neither good nor evil is anything in itself, but that they are only matters of human opinion. And so kind of bringing this together, it feels like a unique contribution of Christianity is to really want to have a problem of evil, and to say that some things aren't just non-ideal, they're not just matters of human opinion, they're not just different perspectives, but they are genuinely wrong. With a capital W.
Yeah. So this is a great setup, a great question, because, you know, one of the things that I find so fascinating is exactly what you pointed out, which is that in a lot of pagan, and here, in some ways, I almost want to differentiate the pagan philosophers like Plato or Aristotle from the pagans, right, who are practicing paganism. But I won't. I've been referring to them as pagan philosophers. But I've even had like monks on Mount Athos tell me like, they didn't really think about them as pagans. I'm like, I know, you know, like, but anyway, but it's interesting that in so much of pagan myth, it's not obvious that any of the gods are good or evil. And this comes out actually for somebody like Plato, right? So in the Euthyphro dilemma, when the Euthyphro dialogue, where he's on his way to trial, and he encounters Euthyphro, this young man, Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is also going to trial. And he's like, oh, what trial are you going? Oh, my father is on trial. Oh, really? For killing a slave? Oh, I see. So you're going to testify on his behalf. He says, no, I'm going to testify against him. And Socrates is shocked. He's like, what? You don't feel any conflict over like your duties to your father versus like this whole thing? And Euthyphro is like, nah, man, I know exactly what virtue is all about. And Socrates is drop jawed and like, I have to become your student because clearly you are wiser than me. And Euthyphro, he is like, no, the secret to knowing what the good is, you just do what the gods do. And Socrates is immediately disappointed. He's like, which gods? And then, of course, he has to modify that principle, of course, because not all the gods agree. And, you know, and eventually you arrive at what is called the Euthyphro problem, where Socrates asks, is God good because he does the good, right? Or is the good good because God does it? And that's what he wants to know. And of course, Euthyphro doesn't answer it. I'm busy. You know, that's a great question, Socrates. I got to go. You know, we don't get an answer to the question. But of course, in Plato's view, it does evolve into, in Plato's philosophy, and obviously I'm using Plato and Socrates interchangeably here because Plato is the one who's recording Socrates' dialogue. We eventually see that God is the good, right? There is this highest, the good that refracts into all the particular goods, and that the good is God, right? And this is, and the reason that's important though is it's intriguing to me that among so much of the pagan philosophy, as you pointed out, it's not clear that you actually have a good and evil, right? And I think it's in Hesiod that you start to get hints of it, right? That perhaps I would defy even the gods for the sake of this higher justice, right? Something like that. And so now it's sort of this question of what is that, right? This thing that's above the gods. And eventually that becomes God for the pagan philosophers, right? As you start to look at it. you start to have people like Plato who still believes in the gods, right? When he gives his entire creation narrative in the Timaeus, he still entrusts the world to the providence of the demons and things like that, which, as you pointed out, like a daemon isn't necessarily a devil, right? The way we would later talk about demons. The gods, the rational beings of creation, including you and me, Um, and, and so he still has that in there, but there's this highest, the good, right? That is the thing that is that which generates and determines the difference between good and evil. And that becomes a pretty consistent thing amongst the pagan philosophers. People like Xenophanes, you mentioned Heraclitus, where it's like the logos, right? This became a consistent feature of what was a fork in the road, to go to your Justin Martyr quote, where he's talking about some people thinking it's just pleasure or pain, right? Like that there's nothing that's really objectively good or evil. But one of the things that starts to emerge is the fork in the road amongst these ancient philosophers between what you might call a providentialist, what I call a providentialist, and a non-providentialist. So a providentialist believes that the world is ordered by something like a mind. And in that sense, there is some organizing supreme mind or word or love, right? They all name it different things, that gives structure and harmony to the world and moves it towards its proper formation. And you have providentialists who believe that on one side, and then you had others who are like, no, it's just chaotic matter in motion, and what we call good and evil is just pleasure and pain. And so what's intriguing is that becomes the real fork in the road, and the prominent position becomes the providentialist position. The Epicureans, who represented the other position, were kind of sneered at as like, that's ridiculous. How could you possibly believe that all of this is just chaotic atoms falling and randomly coalescing? That's ridiculous, right? They couldn't possibly entertain it. But the providentialists ended up moving toward this notion of, I want to say it's Anaxagoras. It's referred to as mind or nous. And Plato really liked that. Of course, he then also names it the good. You have Empedocles, who wants to say it's love is the organizing principle, but that's clearly a deity in Empedocles. And so that notion of not just our guys versus your guys, or I'm on this side and they're on that side, or I like this person and therefore I'm rooting for them, but actually saying this one is right and this one is wrong, this one is good, this one is evil, was something that is really the inheritance of the philosophers. And that's one of the reasons why, to no surprise, then the pagan providentialists who believe in that start to end up in conversation with Jews like in Alexandria, and then Christians, who are basically all providentialists, who all believe this. And now all of a sudden the discussions are in-house discussions. Is this being personal or is this being not personal? Does this being have a son that he sent into the world? Did he give us any sort of laws and reveal himself to us? And those sorts of things. So that really does seem to be, I think you're right, that the movement toward sort of very objective good and evil, it is something that is certainly true of Christianity. It's something that was sort of moving toward within the pagan philosophers, where they were recognizing that. They're giving a real ontological status. But as I said, their tendency was to explain the polarity by an ontological polarity. Right. And so they tended to, even though they were moving toward this objectivity, they tended toward some form of metaphysical dualism. So for Plato, the forms are good, right? And then matter is evil. Well, it's not evil necessarily, although in later Middle Platonists it might be evil. It's just pesky and non-cooperative and chaotic, right? And that's the explanation. And in Empedocles, it is two gods. Love is the god that orders things. Strife is the god that drives chaos. And then obviously you had all the different mystery cults like the Manichaeists or the Gnostics, who also had like polarities of like flesh is evil and spirit is good, or, two opposing deities or whatever it might be. The unique contribution of Christianity was the thing that I mentioned earlier, that not only is there an objective good, but that objective good is the thing that gives rise to everything. And for that reason, everything that exists is good in its original state. And evil is not a second principle. It's not an additive principle. It's not a second God. It has no reality of its own. It is always a shadow existence. It's always a twisting of something that's good, a distortion of something that's good, a privation of something that's good, a corruption of something that's good. But it is never its own substantive reality. It's always a cancer, right? Or a parasite.
And C.S. Lewis kind of picks up on that with his famous argument, doesn't he, that how can a man call a line crooked if he has no idea of a straight line?
Exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So, yeah. One of the things I just wanted to mention here is, and this is to tie back a couple of different threads, pulled together a couple of different things that we've talked about, is that we've been talking about, I tend to talk because I'm, a historian of ideas. I tend to talk about the ideas and how ideas move from one to another. But something that I think is really interesting is I mentioned when I was talking about like the gods of the nations being demons that St. Paul says. On the one hand, I talked about, that in Paul, and I sort of gave the textual basis for that. But one of the things that's interesting is that in early Christians, a lot of their demonology was actually based on experience. And so Athenagoras talks about, the gods of the demons he'll talk about how the gods of the nations are demons who appeared to men and demanded worship under certain images, and they would show up and sort of crawl under those images, like appear underneath, like in those statues or whatever. And he says, and we know that because the demons tell us during exorcism. And so he doesn't just make it like an abstract theology. It's like, we do exorcisms. And we talk to the demons during exorcism, and they've told us stuff they've done. And I find it really interesting that, like even in Athanasius, one of his apologetic reasons, right? Like one of his, proofs for Christianity is our exorcisms work. So I think there's a tendency for us, we tend to just kind of like, let's just talk about the rational reasons for this. And yet within so much of ancient demonology, or even apologetics, the on-the-ground reality of it is part of their demonology, right? It's the actual experiences of it. And I say that because obviously where we started was me talking about this horror project that went from very abstract to very concrete pretty quickly. And so it is with early Christian demonology.
Yeah. Wow. This has been a great deep dive into the theology of evil. I wonder if a good place to finish might be, I saw a clip of, do you know Destiny?
Destiny? I'm not sure.
He's a kind of YouTube streamer, philosopher, political commentator. But essentially he was on
Doesn't ring a bell.
He was on a podcast debating a Roman Catholic called T.K. Coleman, a philosopher. Okay. And they were talking about whether there is objective morality, essentially. And T.K. Coleman does a very interesting move where he basically walks Destiny through the implications of his own worldview. I'll play it to you if that's all right, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Okay. But I think it kind of is an interesting juxtaposition of where some of these ideas go if you lose some of the objectivity. Let's see if I can share screen here.
Can you prove that your experience you're having right now is like the realest thing in the universe and you're not a brain in a vat?
No, I couldn't prove that.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, so that's my position, I guess, yeah. Do we differ there, or could you be a brain in a vat that exists that the people who are experimenting on you might be able to conceive of things or perceive things that is inconceivable or imperceptible to you?
Yeah, so I do think you can argue your way out of that, but okay. I do want to say that the brain in the vat, that's still a form of realism. because the brain in the vat theory is to say that what I am is the brain sitting in the vat, but there's a vat that I didn't create. Somebody else put me here, and all of these experiences I have really are being imposed on me from the outside. Somebody's putting these signals into my brain and telling me that there's a tree over there, what have you. Sure. And so that would mean that the world is real, the tree is real, but the substance of it is something different than what it might seem to me.
Sure. But I'm only bringing that up because I'm saying that there can be real I'm not arguing with the brain in the vat against the difference between moral realism or the physical realism. I'm more so saying that when I speak of things as being real on a physical level, I'm still working within kind of what I understand to be the subjective constraints of the human mind for what we can perceive. Sure. So when I say things are real, I mean that. When I say there's a difference between the realness of like the physical world and the realness of the moral world, I'm not saying that whatever you're calling moral realism is totally bunk because I have objective physical truth of all things on my side. I'm just saying that it seems like that's another layer of abstraction. It's a different type of truth, the same way that Harry Potter is a different type of truth than whatever physical facts are that I can perceive in the world. Yeah.
All right. So why is it rationally permissible for you to say, I can set forth an alternative explanation for why people feel the moral impulse without there being moral structures? That's permissible for you to say, and that successfully undermines my position. But I can't say, I can submit an alternative for why you seem to see the things you see and for why you even think the way that you think. And that doesn't undermine your position. What's the asymmetry there?
Can you give me an example of what type of thing you would posit?
Yeah. Okay. So let me try to format your objection to me syllogistically, and you tell me if I'm representing you well. We could say, statement one, our moral intuitions can be accounted for with evolutionary explanations. Statement two, evolutionary explanations track survival, not reality. Statement three, our moral intuitions track survival, not reality. Therefore, our moral intuitions are only a reliable source for survival, not knowing reality. Is that a fair representation?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So now I'm just going to repeat that the best I can and just substitute something else.
Sure.
Okay. The way in which our brain processes information can be accounted for by evolutionary explanations. Evolutionary explanations track for survival, not reality. The way our brain processes information tracks for survival, not reality. Therefore, the way our brain processes information is not a reliable source for truth, but for survival.
Okay.
Why does that work against moral realism, but it doesn't work against your very cognitive processes by which you come up with arguments against moral realism?
Okay. I'm going to totally flip my position, okay?
Okay.
I don't have these discussions too often.
Well, this could be fun. Maybe we can create something new.
Let me, I'm going to restate in plain language what you're saying, because now I think I understand what your objection is, okay?
Okay.
So, I'm arguing for physical realism, but moral anti-realism. And you're telling me, well, whatever argument you put forth for physical realism, and you said this in the beginning, would necessarily carry over to moral realism. And I'm trying to argue, well, there's different structures that I see to kind of like physical realism and what you're calling this moral world. And you're saying, okay, well, all the ways that you can describe morality, you're accounting for all of your intuitions and feelings are being just survival mechanisms, essentially. And I'm saying, well, yeah, of course. And you're saying, okay, well, it seems to me that you're so epistemically humble that you're also willing to say all of your physical things and perceptions are the same thing.
Yeah.
I think I have to say yes to that based on everything I've said. Yeah. But then I guess that would make me a physical anti-realist. But now I've changed my position completely. So I should have never said physical realism in the first place, which might be the truth. Yeah, that might be the case.
Would it be more fair to describe what you're doing not as changing your position, but realizing based on where the discussion has gone that you'll need to be more precise and refined in your presentation of what you believe?
Sure. Or rather, I shouldn't ever identify it, I guess, as physical realism.
So you just wanted me to react to this?
Yeah, I'm just intrigued what you make of that, because I realize that's maybe bringing in other issues as well. But, you know, respect to Destiny for acknowledging that his position changed there. But just the way TK Coleman just kind of artfully erodes that foundation and shows actually how can we, if our brains are just, if all our intuitions are just kind of based on survival, kind of how can we trust anything whatsoever?
Right. So that's actually an argument. So the argument being used there, as far as I know, I think he might be the first person who developed the argument, was Alvin Plantinga. So Alvin Plantinga, the analytic philosopher, had basically made this argument against a naturalist. What he called it a theistic argument against naturalistic evolution or something like that. And the idea was basically to say this, right? That if evolution is actually the case, and our faculties, we'll just use that broadly, our faculties are not aimed at truth telling. They're not designed for the purpose of truth telling, but rather they are emergent out of happenstance that's aimed at survival. Well, survival and truth telling are not always aligned, right? And if that's the case, then we have no reason to actually trust that our faculties are telling us true things about the world as much as they are telling us things that are useful for survival. And Alvin Plantinga's point in this was to say, well, if that's the case, then why should I trust anything my faculties say, right? In other words, the naturalistic view of evolution that treats my faculties as mere sort of happenstance aimed at survival undermines my faculties' reliability. And since my faculties are the way I came to the theory of evolution, I'm in an incoherent position. I'm trusting what my faculties tell me about the world, i.e. evolution, but evolution tells me I shouldn't trust my faculties, right? And that was basically what he points out. Now, he says, the alternative is if you're a theistic evolutionist, and you believe that God designs your faculties for truth-telling, you could still say that the instrumental means by which those faculties are developed is evolution. But because it's actually guided evolution with an aim of not just survival, but truth-telling, then you could consistently say, I believe that, these evolutionary processes are the mechanical means, the instrumental means by which God did it. But because God is the one doing it, that's why my faculties are reliable. And he says that would be coherent, right? That would be consistent. But his entire point was to say that only a theist could have a coherent view of evolution. A naturalist could not, meaning an atheist, right, could not have a coherent view of evolution. I think he's quite right, actually, on this. Where they actually started before they went there was another thing that I'm generally interested in, which is, and anybody who's listened to my channel consistently, like my podcast consistently, they would know this about me, that I tend to talk about properly functioning faculties, which is another thing that people like Alvin Plantinga have talked about in the past. He and I are very different worldview-wise, right? Obviously, he's Reformed, I'm Eastern Orthodox, and we're also different in a variety of metaphysical areas. But I do think the push toward properly functioning faculties is the right sort of direction to go in terms of epistemology. And so within epistemology, right, how do you know that you know that you know? That area of philosophy, there's sometimes a distinction drawn between, like, obviously we have skepticism over here, but let's talk about, in terms of people who aren't skeptics, there's sometimes a distinction drawn between, say, a hard foundationalist and a soft or a moderate foundationalist. And what's the difference there? Well, a hard foundationalist is somebody who's like René Descartes, and they want to say, like, look, my beliefs are only rational if they're built brick by brick by brick on, sort of irrefutable proofs. And that's the only way to have a rational worldview. And so if you've ever read Descartes' Meditations, basically it starts with skepticism. I'm going to doubt everything. I'm going to doubt that I exist. I'm going to doubt that God exists. I'm going to doubt that there's an external world. I'm going to entertain I'm a brain in a vat, that sort of thing. And then I'm going to slowly try to see if I can get myself out of, like, the skeptical straitjacket that I've put myself into, right? Can I do a Houdini and, like, I got out of it? And that's what Descartes is doing. And that's the quintessential example in the history of ideas of hard foundationalism, where you are I'm going to strip down everything and only build a concrete foundation. Now, people like myself tend to think that that's actually folly. And the reason is because Descartes he strips away all the stuff. He doubts that he exists, God exists, the external world, all this sort of stuff, right? But the problem, and then you get to the famous like cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And that's the one thing in philosophy basically everybody knows, right? They've heard that phrase. I'm not sure how many people know what it means, but for Descartes, it's an analytic statement. I'm doubting, therefore there is an I. Like that's what it is. It's an argument to say I can't formulate my doubt. The one thing I know for sure is that I'm doubting. And I can't formulate doubt without a doubter. And so that's how he tries to get back. Oh, now I've got a self, right? At least I've got a self doing the doubting. And then he has to go from there and try to build up. What's interesting is you would think where he'd go to is the external world, but he actually doesn't. He goes to God next. And the reason is because he's convinced that unless there is a God who is not a deceiver, he cannot trust his faculties. It's a rather interesting move that happens with Descartes. Now, as interesting as I think Descartes' project is, I think it's destined to fail. And the reason is because one of the things that Descartes never abandons is reason itself. And I think if you're really going to be a true through and through skeptic, you're going to have to entertain that I'm a calculator, that when I punch in 2 + 2, I get 5. And I think that's right. And I can't think otherwise because I'm just a broken machine, right? Like you would have to entertain that. But the problem with doing that is that, once you do that, there's no getting back, right? Because how are you going to reason your way back if reason itself has been stripped from your hands? And I think that's the one thing that is so dishonest about hard foundationalism, is that it claims to doubt everything, but it holds on to something really important, reason. And so far from doubting everything, you've held on to something pretty important. And the problem is, you might say, well, yes, but then maybe you should be a skeptic. But here's the problem that I think is equally disingenuous about skepticism. The skeptic's going to try to convince me of skepticism, which means the skeptic's doing the exact same project as the hard foundationalist. He's sitting here reasoning with me. You might be a brain in the vat, right? And he's giving me all these arguments that he wants me to reasonably move from his present premises to his conclusion in order to be persuaded that I shouldn't trust my faculties. But his argument requires me to trust reason, just like Descartes' project requires me to trust reason. If I don't trust reason, what do I care what his arguments are, right? And you add to that, of course, that the skeptic goes on and then proceeds to live his life and go to work and do all sorts of things that actually proves that he isn't a true skeptic. He's just a skeptic when he plays an academic game, but he goes back into the world and lives as all the rest of us live, as somebody who actually does believe he's in a world and that he's a person and that there are other people and so on and so forth. And I do think if a philosophy is utterly unlivable, which skepticism is, that in itself is a proof against it. So what's the alternative? And the alternative that I've always come to and advocated for is, moderate foundationalism, which is basically to say, look, there's no getting around first principles. And don't tell me the skeptic doesn't. As I said, the skeptic gets to his skepticism by reasoning. So he still has first principles of trusting reasoning at some sort of basic sense, some sort of basic level. And so if we need first principles in order to begin, I see trusting my faculties as aimed at truth-telling, as reliable and aimed at truth-telling, which is the one thing that all of us come into the world before we ever take a philosophy class. That's what we presume, that there's stuff in front of me because my eyes are telling me there's stuff in front of me, that there's sound in the air because my ears are telling me that these are the sorts of things that just sort of we accept, that they're aimed at truth-telling until the skeptic comes along and tries to spoil our fun. And so I'm inclined to think that trusting your faculties as somehow properly functioning, unless you have a very good reason to think they're not, like you're colorblind or something like that, and aimed at telling you true things about the world is the right place to start. But I think once you do that, a lot of other things come into play that a lot of people don't realize. And so this is a big thing that I talk about a lot in my podcast. The most important question is the first episode that I did. And I have it pinned on my YouTube channel because I think it's sort of a thesis statement for a lot of the different things that I talk about. But one of the things that I think when people first sort of embrace, like, okay, I'll trust that my faculties are properly functioning, they become materialists, atheists, empiricists, right? They're like, so that's the most rational, moderate foundation position. I don't think it is at all. And the reason is because one of the questions, the question that I say in my podcast is the most important question, is this question of realism. Now, they were using realism in a different sort of way. They were talking about like moral realism versus moral relativism. And they were using physical realism in that conversation in a strange way, meaning like matter is real or something like that, I think is probably how they were using that term. But realism in the sort of classical philosophical tradition refers to something else entirely. You and I, every other rational being that comes into this world, from the moment we step into a world and have the ability to ask questions or articulate or whatever, we think in terms of genera and species and common properties. So a child always asks, Mom, what is that? Right? They're asking species of thing. They're not asking who it is, right? They're asking what it is. And it's because you and I automatically think in terms of genera and species, human, right? Animal, human, bipedal, right? Whatever it might be. And the question of realism is saying, why do we do that, right? The realist, like one option is to say, well, the mind does that because that's how the world is. It actually is a series of genera and species and common properties. And the mind actually recognizes that and it abstracts it, right? Because that's the way the world is. That's one option. That's realism. If you say that, you're a realist because it's real, right? Now, the alternative is what's called nominalism, from the Latin nomen, for name. So if you say, like, look, it's all just matter and motion, right? There are no genera, species, structures, order, stuff like that. It's just random matter around. But the mind can't handle that. So it comes up with a series of names to help organize its experience. But those aren't real, right? Those are just imposed on it. Then you're a nominalist, from the Latin nomen. They're just a bunch of names. Now, the reason I think that's the most important question is because if you follow that first episode of mine, right, and you'll see that I trace the entire history of ideas. And I think you can actually map the entire history of ideas based on that one question. And every other question becomes a sub-question. But here's the thing. If you embrace nominalism, your faculties are no longer reliable. Because what you're saying is that the world isn't that way at all. Now, keep in mind, this isn't just about how we do zoology or something like that. This is about the very act of perception. So you're looking out into the world right now. And a lot of people, most people, virtually everyone, will say, I see, and then they'll name the stuff. I see the screen in front of me. I see the cord. I see my coffee cup. I see the table. I see the floor. I see my legs, my boots, whatever, right? But the fact of the matter is your eyes aren't doing that. Your mind is doing that. Your eyes are giving you a bunch of light and shadow information, right? But your mind is the one, so automatic you don't even notice it, that's breaking it all up into genus and species. Boot, pant, right? Light, shadow, right? The mind is the one that's doing that. And it's doing it according to realist principles. And so your every act of perception is an exercise in realism. Every act of reasoning that you gauge in is an act of realism. So if you sit here and you do a syllogism, they were talking, I think he said that he was going to do a syllogism, but a syllogism is two premises and one conclusion. I think he had three premises and one conclusion, which isn't actually a syllogism. But if a syllogism would be something like all cars are red, this is a car, therefore this is red, right? That would be a simple syllogism. Here's the problem. Syllogisms function on groups. Cars, that's a species of thing. Red, it's a property, right? All of reasoning, if I'm going to sit here and I say, look, all of this is just matter in motion. I used a whole lot of nouns. This, matter, motion. I'm using a series of generics. And what that means is that all of language, all of reasoning, all of scientific induction, right? Telomere or the terminus of a DNA strand. These two are telomere, they're fused, therefore they were once DNA strands that have come together. That's all realist terms. Genera and species. All of that ceases to function if you're anomalous. And this is one of the reasons why somebody like, there's a Thomist. I'm not a Thomist, but I like this particular Thomist. His name's Gilson. And there's a passage where he says something wonderful, which he says, the first step to convincing somebody of realism is to help them to realize they've always been a realist. The second step is to help them see that the moment they cease to play a role in a philosophical argument and go back to life, they will continue being a realist. And the third step is to get them to ask why. And obviously, the why of it is to say, you can't live as a nominalist. You will talk as a realist. You will think as a realist. You will infer as a realist. And you will perceive as a realist. And that's why once I go to moderate foundationalism and I say, look, I'm going to accept that my faculties are properly functioning, all of a sudden I have to embrace realism. And that tells me something very important about the world. On the providentialist, non-providentialist question, the providentialist is the one that says our world is structured and ordered according to genera, species, common properties. The anti-providentialist is the one who says it's just matter in motion. In other words, if I embrace realism, I also embrace a form of providentialism, because what I'm actually saying is that the structures of mind, rational structures, precede matter and give to it order. And that's what I perceive. That's what the realist says. And I don't think that can be avoided. And for that reason, that doesn't tell me that that mind that precedes matter is personal. It doesn't tell me he has a son. It doesn't tell me he's a he. It doesn't tell me he works miracles or revealed himself to Moses or anything like that. But for my part, I don't think there's a way of getting around that moderate foundationalism is the right epistemological starting point. And once you have that, you now have realism. And with realism, you have providentialism of a certain kind. And then I think that also unfolds into all sorts of things like morality, the fact that you have moral intuitions that you can't shake. That tells me that that's detecting something real. I think you also have the paranormal, to circle back to the numinous. Because the fact of the matter is everyone knows what it's like. I like to say everyone believes in ghosts, even the hard-bitten atheist who claims he doesn't. And the reason is because if you stick him in an abandoned insane asylum in the middle of the night, he will be afraid, and it's not because he thinks a hobo lives there. Now, he can try to explain it away. Oh, it's an evolutionary instinct that I have to suppress. But the very fact that he has to suppress it tells me it's part of our innate faculties to detect that there's something on the other side of the veil. And so once I embrace moderate foundationalism, I don't know how to not be a providentialist, a supernaturalist, right? A moral realist. And so those are my responses. That when I hear where that conversation began, those are the things where I would take it.
Yeah, that's so helpful that the other positions actually undermine the very mechanism you're using to make the argument.
That's right.
Yeah, that's
beautiful. Even as anomalous, I would have to argue using realist principles. That's the thing, is the thing to always pay attention to. And I was watching this when Divine, is that his name, was talking.
Destiny, sorry.
There's a temptation. Oh, Destiny. Yeah. Is that what it is? Destiny. Okay. There's a temptation to get distracted with the argument and forget the fact you're arguing.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That means you believe in reason. You believe in the structures of reality that make reason valid in the first place. And that's the thing. If I sat here and listened to a novelist who was like pounding all these arguments against realism, the one thing that would be problematic is that he's arguing. And to argue in syllogistic fashion is to be a realist.
Yeah. Wow. And it's so interesting because I think there was maybe a lot of people would maybe say that their philosophy is like Destiny's, and that it's the logical outworking of their belief that this universe created itself and evolution is, we're just, organisms driven by natural selection and all of this. But in terms of how many people actually live their life as if that is all there is,
it's precious few.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you probably don't want to meet them, whoever they might be.
Indeed.
Right? That would be Ted. I'm pretty sure Ted Bundy did live out moral relativism. In fact, you can read the transcripts of his, which I often would in a ethics class. When I'd open with like moral relativism versus moral realism, I would actually read his transcripts where he describes a fully materialist worldview, the ramifications of it, and why what he's about to do to these people these women is not actually evil. And he's going to enjoy it. And that's all there is, prey and predator and showing like pleasure and pain. And he's going to enjoy it. And their pain is indifferent to him because it's not his.
Yeah, I was reading a book called The Devil's Best Trick by Randall Sullivan. I don't know if you've read that, but he kind of does a history of evil. And the Marquis de Sade is obviously a very disturbing figure from history. And he kind of set himself up as someone, when all these Enlightenment thinkers were saying that, there's no objective morality, he was like, cool, I'm going to follow that to its logical conclusion and do all these atrocities. But if it's fine, right? Who are you to say it's wrong? But what's interesting is in this book, this guy argues that it seems there was something else going on there. He wasn't just following out the logical outworkings of rejecting morality. He would do things like desecrate the Eucharist and those kinds of things. And it seemed that actually he wasn't just setting himself up as being completely amoral. He was setting himself up as being in opposition to God. The claim of neutrality is one that people can try to make, but it goes back to what we were saying, that if everything we do is resonating with some kind of spirituality, and that can either be God or something else, it seems hard to get away from that.
It does. Yeah, it does. And I think part of the reason for that is because it's very easy for someone to say, okay, I no longer believe in God and objective good and evil and these sorts of things, and then proceed to live as a generally good person. In other words, they tend to live in a way that's broadly Christian, right? Now, it might not be Christian in the way the church fathers who are willing to be martyred are Christian, but it's broadly Christian in the sense of, if you follow the Tom Holland Dominion argument and you start to look at like the way people conducted themselves pre-Christian versus post-Christian is very different. It's a naive assumption that says that basically, that humanity naturally behaves in certain ways that are generally good and so on. And that historically speaking, that's actually not true. That's largely a byproduct of Christianity taking over the world. They live in a broadly Christian way. They're generally, I'm not trying to go out and hurt anybody or anything like that. And yet, I think that's one of those things that the more Nietzschean among us, the more Nietzschean among us are folks who basically recognize, like, no, if you're really going to embrace that road, well, first of all, there's no ought. So we can't say what they ought to do because there are no such things as what you ought to do. But it makes quite a lot of sense to say, well, if I'm really going to break ties with this, then I have to realize that my generally good inclinations are probably a product of this, and I'm not really breaking ties with it if I continue to submit to those. And so I'm going to unshackle myself from all that is good and holy. And that's the thing, is like, to go ahead and desecrate the Eucharist or something like that, you'd be like, well, why would anybody do that? Who cares if you just think it's bread and wine? Well, the reason is because to really sort of demonstrate that I truly do believe that there is no such thing as sacrilege, because there is no such thing as God, and there is no such thing as good and evil. These sorts of, Ubermensch, right? These sorts of Superman tendencies to say, I'm going to do the thing that everyone else is too cowardly to do. It almost becomes a bona fide of demonstration that I really do believe this philosophy, such that I'm going to follow to its logical conclusion, not because I ought to do these things, but because it's part of the unfettering process of it that shows that I really do have the will, the sheer will and stomach to do things that most think ought not to be done and are transgressive, but I don't think there's anything to transgress. And if I really believe that, right, I have to, in some ways, break the bonds that are upon me. And really, at the end of the day, the sacrilegious part, like God, as I said, is, when you're talking about, as you pointed out, with regard to pagan, the pagan religions, they weren't so much about good and evil, right? They were primarily about utility and power, and tribalism is primarily what is one of the reasons Nietzsche himself isn't terribly down on paganism. He thinks that's actually pretty good, right? Because it actually is a display of the will to power. But, once you start to say there's objectively binding oughts and ought nots, a way the world ought to be, and I am a subject to that, right? It is not that I get to shape the world into whatever I want. It's that the world is a certain way, and the good is that way. And I either conform to that reality, in that sense become good, or I rebel against it and I become corrupt. Once you start to say that, well, you're into the realm of the providential. You're into the realm of deity, in the sense of, the good, whether you're talking about Plato or you're talking about the Christian God or whatever it might be. And so to really sort of cast that off is to go into rebellion against God, whether you think God exists or not. Because God is the ultimate, treat it as a symbol and say he doesn't exist, or recognize him as real. Either way, the thing that you are casting off and trying to break away from is that.
Wow. Well, thank you. That might be a good place to finish this this first chat. That's amazing. We're going to do a follow up, maybe pressing more into storytelling and the theology of storytelling. But Nathan Jacobs, you've been so generous with your time. Where can people keep up with you?
Oh, my pleasure. So there's a couple of different places you can go. You can look up the Nathan Jacobs podcast, which is on YouTube. It's also on, Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts, that sort of thing. And the other thing you can do, if you prefer written formats, I do have a Substack, and you could go to theologicalletters.com. And then there's some other things. I guess I'll just plug this. If people are particularly interested in, when they hear me talk and they're like, oh, this Eastern stuff is really interesting to me because it seems so different. I'm currently in pre-production on what's called the East-West series. And that is really just a series. It's not an endorsement of the East, right? It's just a walk through the history of ideas and all these different doctrines, from doctrine of God and incarnation and gospel and church and Mary and iconography and all this, that walks through the development of the doctrine in the West and then contrasts it with the development in the East. And that's a resource that I've been, prepping to sort of release, because I think right now we're in a time where people are very curious about Eastern Orthodoxy, or very confused about Eastern Orthodoxy, or whatever it might be. And so I thought it was a worthwhile project to do. So if you're interested in that, you could go to the eastwestseries.com. It's actually what it is, the eastwestseries.com. And you can pre-order it, right? Right now, the pre-order price is lower than, what it will be when it's released. So that's sort of to incentivize people because it's actually supporting the creation of that series. So those would be the several places to come and find me if you want to find me.
Amazing. Well, yeah, do go and check those out. But Nathan Jacobs, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.